G'day, Mate 40 here. So I was using Gemini to clean up my blog and the hosting and the WordPress and all that stuff, and it suggested a change to my wp-config file. And so I went and implemented the change, and then my whole website crashed. And even though Gemini helped me uncrash my website fairly shortly, about 15 minutes later, I still haven't recovered, right? What a trauma. This was 5 hours ago. To think that my thousands of blog posts may have been hidden from the world, that someone in need may have been seeking my guidance on a topic, and my website was down. And just that whole sense of vulnerability. I've got 23 years into my blog, and then it all goes away just like that. Just it was a semicolon. I just needed to add a semicolon to the first or second line, and the problem was solved. And thank you, Gemini, for pointing that out. But I felt so vulnerable. And you got to contrast that with the night before. So I've been reaching out to a bunch of friends and family, and so I reconnected with people, and it was good. Right? Sometimes you reconnect with people and they tell you, "Oh, I'll lose my number, never call me again." But this was good. This was high quality connection. And some people, you notice that if you talk to them regularly, you find them a downer. But if you just space out the interactions a bit, or you focus your interactions on certain topics, then it's great. It's like fantastic. It's the best. You couldn't ask for more. So I'm a big believer in dialing people up or down in your life, and even taking notes before a phone conversation to try to get the most out of it. So last night I was feeling great. Like, I felt understood. Is there anything more meaningful than having a good fundamental chat about Ehlers-Dahlos hypermobility syndrome? So not many people understand all the problems that come with Ehlers-Dahlos hypermobility, but I found someone who understood. Right? I don't have it super bad. I'm got it moderately. And so, look, I was hiking at Runyon Canyon yesterday, and this is embarrassing. Look, even the fatties were passing me by. Like, even these women weighing over 300 pounds were walking up Runyon Canyon more quickly than I was. And I don't understand that, but there's an explanation. Like, I thought I was in really good shape, and then I show up at Runyon Canyon and I start going up the hill. I was just absolutely drained. But it's not my fault, bro. It's my Ehlers-Dahlos syndrome. This is Gemini. It's not a lack of cardiovascular effort. It's a lack of mechanical efficiency. So on a hike, my hypermobile stretchy ligaments allow my joints to micro wobble with every step, and that forces my muscles to work double time just to keep me upright. Okay, so when 300-pound women are going up Runyon Canyon more quickly than you are, it is a bit of a shock to your self-esteem, because Runyon Canyon is like a pickup spot, right? This is the place to take dates. This is the place to find love and to give love and to receive love. And love is in the air. But it's hard for me to feel loving. I'm not super receptive to receiving love or giving love when 300-pound women are walking up the hill more quickly than I am. And there's like 3 of them. And they're part of an out group. And I was like, what the heck? So I need to shift from viewing my body as fragile to seeing it as a system that needs better wiring and support. Okay, so my joints rely on muscles for stability more than a normal person. So I need to focus on proprioception. That's my inner sense of where my joints are in space. And in isometric strengthening, I should avoid party tricks, and I should avoid overstretching into the hypermobile range. If I experience a dislocation, I should stay calm and manage my muscle spasms. Panic causes muscles to tighten, which prevents the joints from slipping back into place. High impact or contact sports are discouraged due to the increased risk of acute injury. Swimming, walking, and Pilates exercises are recommended because they provide resistance without jarring the joint. So pace, don't race. Start with low repetitions and slowly increase intensity. See, Ehlers-Dahlos syndrome is why people like me, we get these spiking cortisol, adrenaline. It feels like an adrenaline rush, and it'll hit me at 1 a.m. and then I just can't sleep. But it's all to do with the Ehlers-Dahlos. Work on maintaining a neutral pelvis and spine. Okay, so nutrition. I need to eat salt. I need to eat salty food on a regular basis. Need adequate levels of vitamin D, magnesium, B12. That's why I've got those beef organ capsules. I need ergonomic tools such as pen grips or thick-handled kitchen utensils to reduce strain in my small finger joints. Avoid standing or sitting in one position for too long. Frequent micro movements help prevent blood pooling and joint stiffness. So people with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, we feel the blood just pooling around our bellies because our muscles and joints are weak. Yeah, craving for salt. It's easy to feel lightheaded, dizzy. So I always make sure I've got salt and protein stuff near me. And also, what else do I have here? Also, some electrolytes. I find just having a few electrolytes around, But if you increase your salt intake, you must increase your water intake simultaneously. Salt without water, it's like faith without deeds, guys. Like Dallas without the Cowboys. I should also consider compression stockings. I bought compression stockings about 8 years ago. I was concerned about my feet were swelling a lot. And I was only like a 50-year-old bloke. I shouldn't have feet swelling. All right, specialized electrolyte powders or salt tablets, compression stockings. Right, these provide external pressure on those stretchy veins to help push the blood back toward my heart. And so, look, you don't understand what walking and hiking, it requires more energy for people like me with hyperelastic Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. My tendons, particularly the Achilles, are more compliant. So they don't provide the same elastic snap the typical hiker's body uses to propel forward. So I am overusing my calf and thigh muscles. So whenever I hike Runyon Canyon, usually, I only did it once. Normally I do it twice. And I think if you do it 13 times, it's the same distance as going from base camp to the top of Mount Everest. But I only did it once yesterday because it was my first time doing it in about 6 months. I'm trying to spiritually prepare myself for life without professional football. So I know it's all going to end. This season is all going to end after the Super Bowl, and I'm going to have to face 6 months of life, particularly on Sundays, without professional football to distract me. And so I'm preparing myself to go for hikes and explore the great outdoors. So you don't know what it's like, mate. So there are cardiovascular issues. My blood vessels are more distensible. That doesn't sound good. So my blood vessels struggle to push blood upward against the gravity as I climb. So this triggers a spike in my heart rate. Hiking requires a strong push-off from the ankle. And this push-off for people like me is weaker because our ankle joints are less stable. My body then compensates by overusing hips and knees to drag the weight uphill. So did you see the last episode of Landman? The non-binary trainer helped the hot female cheerleader with her weak ankles. I thought that was beautiful. So I've got a less efficient gait strategy. So I burn through glycogen stores faster than the gait of people passing me. Right? I'm the victim here. So trekking poles, compression gear, pacing the heart. Okay, I feel better now.
Step back, because the question is, what do we mean by...
Have you heard of the blog Legal Insurrection? It's from the one conservative professor at Cornell.
Freedom of speech.
William Jacobson.
And what do we mean by academic freedom? And I'd say for the most part, the university is not going to punish you for your speech if you're a faculty member. But that really jumps over the initial issue, which is there's no diversity of viewpoint on campus. So yes, there is relatively free speech, but there's almost exclusively from the left faculty on campus who express their speech. So it's not really at Cornell and at many of these so-called elite universities. The question is not, will the university punish you? It's, okay, who is even here to speak? And at Cornell, based on the statistics from the Cornell Sun student newspaper, they've reviewed donation histories, political affiliations. It is approaching 100% Democrat. And I can tell you from my own experience, it is approaching 100% in the range from your standard liberal, American liberal, which is probably the biggest cohort, um, to the extreme left. There really is no alternative viewpoint. So to me, it's a little bit of a dodge if the university says, well, yes, we have free speech. We don't, kick people out if we disagree with them. Well, of course you don't, because almost the only people on campus are people you all agree with. And so that's the more fundamental problem to me, which is that for 30 plus years, there has been a purge of non-liberals, and I like the way you put it, non-leftist. I don't know what conservative means anymore, uh, but I know that I'm not leftist. I'm not a collectivist. I'm not that sort of person. But so the people we would normally in pop culture refer to as conservatives are essentially non-existent in the faculty at Cornell. And to the extent there are some, they are extremely quiet. And that's where I think the issues of free speech and academic freedom come in, is that knowing you won't be hired, knowing you won't be promoted, knowing you won't get tenure if you are quote unquote conservative, people hide their feelings. So it's not so much that the university punishes you, it's a culture on campus which is a monoculture and only allows one viewpoint to flourish. That doesn't mean there aren't exceptions. I am the exception. There might be some others, but the exceptions, in a sense, prove the rule, which is it's a monoculture on campus. And that's the most fundamental problem. And so if the development office is pitching people saying, well, we haven't terminated a professor because of their speech, or we haven't kicked students out purely because of their speech, they may be right, but they're not actually answering the problem. And it is a DEI.
So I just hiked Runyon Canyon once. Thought I'd better ease myself into this new regime. Then got to talk to friends, got to talk to family. I was just feeling so good. And in the background, I was watching the National College Championship. And how can you not love Indiana, not love last night's game, not love Indiana's quarterback, their head coach? I was just feeling giddy. And in my feeling of strength and vitality, and I was telling my friends and I was telling my family how good I was feeling, how strong I was feeling, and how psyched I was feeling, and how energized and passionate and ambitious, and I was just plowing my way through life like Ron Jeremy. God forbid, God forbid. The good part of Ron Jeremy, not the dark side. Donald Trump, it reminds me a lot of Ron Jeremy. Whenever I'd run into my uncle Ron Jeremy, he would say, oh, look, did you see that I was in Time magazine last week? Or did you hear that Kid Rock called me up on stage? Or this celebrity said this about me. It's like so Trump-like to take things so very, very personally. And Steve Saylor had a sharp observation that I think he's right on. He says that as people get older, they tend to speak their mind more, or they tend to put less effort controlling themselves, right? As you get older, it becomes harder to control certain parts of your character that you used to have mastery over. So this is Saylor. Egomania has always been a concerning, if entertaining, part of Donald Trump's personality. So last night, the point is I found it hilarious. And then this morning, in the cold light of day, I just found it, I wanted to vomit. So Trump's farcical but far-reaching Greenland crisis, right, highlights the question of whether the 79-year-old's advancing age is making it harder for him to control aspects of his character that he used to have more mastery over. I think that was Ron Jeremy's defense. A younger Trump would no doubt be sore about not winning the Nobel Peace Prize, but would likely have had more self-control to pass it off as perhaps a joke. One problem with aging is a decline in self-control over troublesome aspects of your personality. With most people, this coincides with a decline in the energy needed for self-assertion. But with Trump, the lion, even in winter, still has abundant energy. Trump has exactly 3 years left on his second term. What do you think? Okay, I think that's very sharp analysis, but I just bewildered. Last night, I was pumping out the blogs and the social media posts about Trump's plans to, or threats, or if Trump invades Greenland. To me, last night, that just seemed like the funniest thing ever. I was having such a ball. I felt great. Okay, cold light of day. You wake up, you get going, you crash your website, and then I start thinking about Trump and Greenland. I want to vomit. It's like, what about the international norms, bro? What about all the hard work we've done to make everything more fair and more legal, and we respect people's sovereignty? Whatever happened to the great virtue of respect? So as I became more vulnerable, my internal reactions, my politics, my humor just completely changed. Things aren't funny to me when I'm feeling vulnerable, right? Certainly not the same things. And when I share with you my insights on this matter, you will be chilled to the bone. So apparently safety dictates our perspective, which helps you understand women, because most guys, as I understand it, don't really feel that concerned about their safety very often. But women think about their safety multiple times a day, just walking through an underground parking space alone. So when you feel secure, like Trump threatening to invade Greenland, right, is a joke, right? Because the consequences feel so remote, it's just absurd, and you enjoy it. It's a spectacle. You're a spectator, and you're enjoying a spectacle, right? It just sounds like satire. It sounds like comedy. Now, cold light of dawn. Man, I experience life. My personality is so different between my giddy hours of 7 p.m., 8 p.m., and then getting up at 6 a.m., right? When I feel vulnerable, like I get out of that cold shower and it hurts, bro. It hurts. Then the same concept, the same words, Trump, Greenland, it's not funny to me. Am I just an unstable person? Right? The humor is just completely evaporated. Right? The Donald Trump could take Greenland and he could just start wrecking lives, and what just seemed so funny yesterday feels like chaos today. So apparently humor requires a perceived violation that feels benign. So when you're strong, the violation feels harmless. When you feel weak and vulnerable, the violation feels like a threat. So I guess I react to the world and to political rhetoric pretty much as a barometer of my own internal state of resilience. I will laugh at all sorts of things in the company of friends. Then those very same things will keep me awake at night when I'm alone and frightened. So benign violation theory, right? That was going to be the name of my memoir, but the publisher didn't like it. So a situation first must be a violation of some norm, such as a breach of etiquette. Second, the person must perceive the violation as harmless. And third, the two perceptions must occur simultaneously. So when I feel strong and invulnerable, the threat to Greenland satisfies the second condition, because my strength as a shield, I see the absurdity of Trump invading Greenland without feeling the weight of the damage. Then, when that sense of invulnerability fades, I wake up in the morning and get going, right? This violation no longer feels benign. It becomes threat. I don't have the distance for humor. I'm now prioritizing survival and empathy over the appreciation of the irony. So people in high-stress environments use dark humor. When I'm under stress, I'm less and less nice. I'm more and more brittle. So we use laughter to create the distance that we lack. We try to create something, transform something frightening into something manageable. This is a social glue. You share a laugh over a perceived threat with family and friends, creates a collective sense of power and safety. Yeah, I always leave Dublin, always leave shore feeling stronger than when I entered shore. I would typically enter shore feeling weak, and I would leave feeling strong and connected. And it's that energy released through collective effervescence, right? Through joining, getting on the same page with people like yourself. And it takes a man like me from weak to strong. And so whatever's going on with me in my physical, emotional states, my Ehlers-Dahlos syndrome or my narcissistic personality disorder, whatever, has such a profound effect on how I see the world.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion, infused campus that dominates everything. So put it all together. Yes, technically there is free speech and academic freedom at Cornell. As a practical matter, there's only one group that benefits from that.
Well, Bill, picking up on, I'm still only asking 5 questions, so this is a corollary of the first. I mentioned it about the treatment of Jewish students and maybe Jewish faculty on campus, which I'm in New York, you're in Cornell, which is also in New York, Rhode Island, and so maybe.
So I love the historian Alan Allport, and I love his 2-part series on Britain in World War II, and I love his new book. It's called Advanced Britannia, the epic story of the Second World War. And the first volume, everything that you thought you knew about World War II was wrong. For the first, that's the upshot of his first volume. It just blew my mind, insight after insight after insight. So now I'm going through a second volume and I'm just letting it play all night. It's just so comforting to me. And apparently, in the Second World War, various countries acted primarily in their own interest, and often their own survival required exploitation of another country. So the United States became the dominant global power. And guess what? The British became subordinate. And the Americans didn't really care. And the distribution of sacrifice among the various powers during World War II was not decided on the basis of moral principle. That's pretty shocking. But resources and strategy rested with those who had power, the Americans, and the British just had to accept a secondary position. So the Americans focused on what they wanted. They focused on their own needs. They felt very little obligation to alleviate the domestic hardships of Britain. It's like my girlfriend would tell me, I can always tell during certain procedure, like when you stop caring about me and you're just like totally focused on you. God forbid a girlfriend gave me a copy, The Givers and the Takers. She didn't think I was giving too much. And then the British then mirrored this indifference to the management of their empire. So hundreds of millions of Indians faced starvation in 1942, 43, 44. Why? Because the British prioritized food for Brits, not food for India. So hundreds of millions of people in India during World War II faced starvation, and the attitude of Winston Churchill was, well, let them take care of themselves, which they did, and separated themselves from the British Empire. But you learn about this, and you realize why the British and Winston Churchill are not received with universal honor and positive affection in India, when you just notice the absolute callousness of Churchill and British leaders to a famine that threatens hundreds of millions of Indians. So the US used its power to dictate terms to the fading British Empire. The fading British Empire squeezed and abused their colonies to sustain Great Britain. And shockingly, moral principles played little role in any of these calculations. And the biggest burdens of war fell most heavily on those with the least power to protest. So while we are all locked in an iron cage together, we're not all equally vulnerable. And has it ever been different? Strong do what they will, and the weak endure what they must. That's what Thucydides wrote over 2,000 years ago. And it seems to still be the primary engine of realism in international relations, right? Very rarely do you find dominant powers voluntarily sacrificing their core interests for the sake of weaker neighbors. Sad.
There's a little more coverage of this than there would be in the rest of the country, but I kind of was shocked by the openness of the hostility towards Jewish students at Cornell, on the main campus. Cornell also has facilities in New York City. You've been there for over 20 years or so, or were
18 plus years.
18? Were you kind of yourself?
Well, that's because Israel is an outpost of white supremacism. Right? How can we support white supremacy? I didn't know that Israel was an outpost of white supremacism, but I just recently learned that, and wow.
Were you stunned by what has happened in the last few years after October 7th? You may not be, but
not really stunned. I think it came to the surface very quickly, but I've been covering and dealing with these themes really for well over a decade, for approaching 2 decades, the extreme anti-Israel fervor of the faculty. So not only have they purged conservative faculty, they've purged pro-Israel faculty. Again, that's not to say there are none, but it is a minority. If you are your standard leftist academic, hostile to Zionism.
So if you're not a big fan of Zionism and quite skeptical about Jews, I'm sure this perspective of victimhood will come as a shock. So any group can make a very compelling case for their own victimhood, even probably the most powerful group in the United States today, Jews.
Believes Israel's a white supremacist state. If you're buying into that, you're going to have no problem getting hired, and you're not going to be shy about expressing your viewpoint. On the other hand, if you take a more traditional pro-Israel or at least Israel-friendly attitude, good luck being hired in the humanities and social sciences. It's going to be a problem everywhere, not just at Cornell. I mean, I've had people who have wanted to write for my website who are in, PhD programs or young academics, and they've told me they cannot use their name. They cannot put anything pro-Israel on their CV, or they won't get hired or they won't get promoted. They've got to hide it. So is it a hostile environment? Yes, it has been.
So a friend of mine, an Orthodox Jew, went to about 25 job interviews wearing a yarmulke. He didn't get hired for any of them, so he blamed his yarmulke. And when job interview number 26 came along, right, he took off his yarmulke to get the interview, walks into the interview room, and the person interviewing him is wearing a yarmulke. And the person says, wait, I heard that you had the strength of your convictions to always wear a yarmulke, but now I see that you've given it up. So not always clear when it's to your advantage to wear a yarmulke.
It mostly revolves around the Israel issue. I don't think there's a lot of people on campus who walk around saying, I hate Jews. But when the majority, the super majority of American Jews are supportive of Israel to varying degrees, but supportive of Israel, and you have a campus environment that's hostile to that, I think that is, the dilemma we face in defining anti-Semitism in the modern times is, where does anti-Zionism become anti-Semitism? Well, when you're shouted
Right.
down, when you're disrupted, when you can't bring speakers to campus, when you're demonized. There was just a case in both the New.
You must be so excited, right? You come to this channel to get dissident views, and for the first time, you get to hear the pro-Israel perspective. Like, what a relief. Finally breaking through the media monopoly to get that rare pro-Israel voice that's otherwise just so hard to locate. Pretty exhilarating. Eric Kaufman, he wrote the book White Shift. He's part white, part Asian, part interesting bloke. And he has an essay here, The Truth Behind the Groyper Panic. And what have I been telling you, mate, for years? The problem's not the problem. The problem's a reflection of the deeper problem, unless it comes to murder, right? Murder is the problem. But outside of that, most problems are not our problems. They're reflections of deeper problems. And so too with the Groypers, right? The problem is not Nick Fuentes or Tucker Carlson or Kanye West or far-right celebrities dancing to Kanye's song Heil Hitler in a Miami nightclub, right? Nick Fuentes, Andrew Tate, and his brother Tristan, ethnically Haitian Filipino YouTuber Sneeko, and Sudanese Muslim manosphere influencer Myron Gaines, right? All dancing to this Kanye song. And Fuentes says Hitler is cool, and he uses sexist and racist stereotypes. And Tucker Carlson, man, he platformed him. But here's the point, right? These people really don't matter much, and to the extent they matter because they are a reflection of losers, right? Marginalized losers follow Nick Fuentes. You don't have many dentists following Nick Fuentes. I don't think you got many accountants following Nick Fuentes. I don't think you have many people earning in six figures following Nick Fuentes. I don't think you have many men or women who are married with kids who have a church or a synagogue listening to Nick Fuentes. So when you survey Nick Fuentes' followers, almost none of them are white nationalists, right? Most of them have a fairly positive view of blacks and of Jews, right? His followers are just 12 points cooler towards Jews than other Donald Trump supporters their age. Tucker Carlson, similarly, right? His audience has pretty similar views towards Jews to that of Ben Shapiro, right? Tucker's audience has a warmth of 57 degrees towards Jews. Ben Shapiro's followers, they have a warmth of 65 degrees. So following Tucker Carlson doesn't really associate much with being anti-Jewish. And following Nick Fuentes doesn't make you likely a white nationalist or anti-Jewish or anti-black. So these people like Nick Fuentes and Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson, they get a ton of mainstream media attention, but they're not changing hearts and minds. frequently, if you're into Nick Fuentes, it's because you've got nothing going on in your life and he's offering you something exciting. So people who lose in life have to find some way to prop themselves up. At least I see through the BS, and so they're quite prone to conspiracy theories because that helps them feel superior to everyone else because they get to see through the BS. And so type of people who buy into this nonsense are people who are losing at life, and they just need some internal thing to keep themselves upright. So violating taboos, that's the point of following Nick Fuentes and company. You're an edgelord, you're a rule breaker, right? And it's a completely separate cognitive dimension from being a racist or a white nationalist or an anti-Semite, right? Plenty of these people who openly identify as racist endorse anti-affirmative action. So what you have here primarily is a bunch of nihilistic, apolitical, anti-authority, rebellious, losing at life, marginalized losers who, due to their bad life experiences, tend to be cynical, mistrusting, unreasonable, and prone to believing all sorts of ridiculous things. So they've got to feel something. I went for a walk in the rain once, and it was very uncomfortable, and it was very windy, and it was painful, but I just wanted to feel something. The trust in the government is at an all-time low, and people are losing at life and not going to feel much invested in their community or their nation or in our institutions. And this problem is worsened because so many of our institutions are dominated by the left, and they get into these moral panics over racism, sexism, trans suicide, white supremacy, and they want to suppress speech and wrong thinking in the name of emotional safety, and they destroy trust. So you have this backdrop of truth-mangling humanitarian extremism from our major institutions, and then you have people who hate that and become conspiracy theories and shock jocks because they will tell you the truth. They'll tell it like it is. So, yeah, the followers of Nick Fuentes are nihilistic. They love to provoke. They love stupid theories about life, but they've got nothing to lose, right? They have no reason to be invested in the system.
New York Post in the Free Press about an anti-Zionist professor who kicked an Israeli student out of the class. And to their credit, the university did commence disciplinary proceedings against him. The faculty rallied around him. Okay, that's a whole nother story. But so it is a hostile environment. That there have been very active anti-Israel coalitions built over the years, long before October 7th. And they were always built in a very racialized manner. So it was always students of color, people of color versus Israel. And you can go back to 2014, 17, 19. We covered this at the website. What they would do is before they would bring a boycott motion to the student assembly, they would create a coalition of non-white student groups. And that would be, and so it was a very toxic sort of environment, a very race-infused hostility, and there was a lot of intimidation. That same hostility applied to conservative students on campus as well.
Okay, so these university students who were agitating against Israel and making the case for Hamas, right? Do you think they were the best and the brightest? Right? I suspect they're overwhelmingly affirmative action students who were struggling with their responsibilities and so wanted to burn off the tension and do something exciting.
I mean, because I'm essentially the only openly politically conservative professor on campus, I'm the faculty advisor to almost every right of center student group. So the pressure that pro-Israel students came under on campus, conservative students came under, but it all came to the surface after.
Okay, Donald Trump held a news conference today. Man, his approval ratings going down, down, down. Republicans seem to be in a lot of trouble. What's he got to
Nobody
say?
talks about the fact that $19 billion at a minimum is missing in Minnesota, given to a large degree by Somalians. They've taken it. Somalians, can you imagine? And they don't do it. A lot of very low IQ people, they don't do it. Other people work it out, and they get them money, and they go out and buy Mercedes-Benzes, and they come from here, they have no money. They never had money. They never had a life. They never had a government. They never had a country. because there's basically no country. Somalia is not even a country. They don't have anything that resembles a country. And if it is a country, it's considered just about the worst in the world. They come here and they become rich and they don't have a job. I was told that Ilhan Omar is worth $30 million. She never had a job.
Okay, apparently Senator Bernie Sanders was a no-shower. He skipped every meeting in his 18 years on the Holocaust Museum Board. So, for many Jews, such as Bernie Sanders, there are higher priorities in their life than the tribe. And it doesn't make them a bad person, right? Some Jews, their highest priority is supporting capitalism or communism or socialism or free markets or science or journalism. Not every Jew makes his primary identity the tribe. In fact, most American Jews are far more devoted to America than they are to anything Jewish. Only about 10 to 15% of Jews are Orthodox.
After October 7th. And when I say after October 7th, I mean like October 8th. I always say to people, if you want to understand how bad it was, don't look at October 7th, look at October 8th. There were marches on campus, calls for intifada, which was the violent suicide campaign against Israel, denunciations, graffiti, intimidation of students, intimidation of Jewish students. So it all that I'd been seeing for a decade prior to October 7th came right up to the surface.
What was that movie with Robert De Niro playing a mobster that was analyze this? So I went to that movie with Kendra Jade, and there was a scene in there where maybe it was The Sopranos, where the big mob guy says, "Do you kiss your mother with that mouth?" And so you could think about the Groypers. Do they kiss their mother with that mouth after they say those terrible things? But yeah, people are complicated. And the important thing with regard to Zoomers is that they are not invested in society, and they've woken up to how many of our leaders and leading institutions have been lying to them. And when people wake up to these lies, they don't tend to react moderately. Right? They tend to overreact. So someone goes along to get along, is following all the normal rules, and then they recognize, oh, I've been lied to about everybody just has equal talents. No, different groups tend to have different gifts. And then people think, oh, well, I've been lied to about everything. So apparently swing voters, young and minority voters moving between parties, are twice as likely to hold conspiratorial views because they are half as likely to have much going on in their life. If they own property, if they are married, if they're committed to their families, friends, and community, right, they're be much less tempted to buy into these exciting but stupid beliefs. So the power of the Groypers is overstated. But what's important here is the nihilism and mistrust that they exploit are real. And why is there so much nihilism and mistrust? Because our elites and our institutions have been lying to us. Now, the important thing is they lie to us for good reasons, right? We have these various no-fly zones to protect vulnerable groups. And so all sorts of groups are exempt from public social criticism. So you have protected, marginalized, vulnerable groups, however you call them, such as Jews, blacks, Muslims, LGBTQ community. And so maybe you have these no-fly zones, no criticism zones for good reasons, right? They argue that we need these restrictions on speech to provide emotional safety, to reduce social harm, to prevent escalation that comes from hate, to provide social cohesion, so we shouldn't point out certain inconvenient things. But this all comes with a huge price, right? You are reducing truth-seeking, truth-telling, and you declare certain topics off limits, and the epistemics of America suffers. People can't speak honestly about their observations, about their life experiences, about the data, because these observations contradict the sacred narrative. And so then people lose trust in what they are told by our institutions and politicians and media is true. So there's a vacuum, resentment grows, and people are seeking alternative and more radical sources of information like this live stream. And these no-fly zones. You can't criticize Jews, blacks, gays, Latinos, or any vulnerable, historically marginalized community, right? These no-fly zones are enforced by the people with the most power in our society, particularly those elites in academia, media, and HR departments. So those in power define what is acceptable to say, what is a valid critique, and what is hate. And so they shield their own preferred social hierarchies and political alliances from scrutiny. What a good deal for them. And they get to rule by making an alliance with these marginalized groups. Elites could not rule if we had a united country. Elites can only rule in a pluralist society. And so elites make deals with these marginalized, vulnerable communities. We will protect you. In exchange, you will support us. And so elites are able to pick off enough of these marginalized communities to assemble a coalition that effectively grants them power. So there's a chilling effect when you're not allowed to critique certain groups. You have a retreat from an open marketplace of ideas, and you don't get to refine and correct social policies that fail, even though these policies have noble goals, but they are at war with reality, which you're not allowed to mention. When you suppress truth, when you suppress speech, right, the speech doesn't disappear, it goes underground. Right? People become more attached to their edgy views, and they are more difficult to shift from bad ideas through public debate, such as the Groypers, because they live in these echo chambers, because they recognize that many of our major institutions were lying to them. And these no-fly zones also are a form of status closure. You can only advance in many institutions if you are a person of the lie, right? If you're a man of the truth, you're not going to advance in large swaths of America. So if you are quite willing to lie and quite willing to play the game, then you can get power and money and prestige and get access to resources and sex and money and all sorts of great things in life. You just have to be flexible in your commitment to truth. You just have to be economical in your truth. So what drives our politics is not deep moral values such as equality or tolerance. The reason that we have these no-fly zones is not coming from moral concern and safety. Right? That's the rhetoric. But what people say is not the reality. You don't have to take people at their word. You don't have to take Nick Fuentes and the Groypers and Richard Spencer and this or that. You don't take people at their word, because incentives are such. People rarely say what they mean, rarely mean what they say. People usually just say what is expected of them in a particular situation. But what we do have that is real and deep is an evolved psychology for forming alliances, because you want the people with their hand on the coercive power of government to be on your side. So to develop an alliance, people must be forced to signal loyalty. And so sacralizing a group, declaring it off limits for critique, creates a powerful tag or marker, enables you to form a powerful coalition, elites versus the most vulnerable. And then we put out all this beautiful sounding rhetoric, and we make it socially and professionally and economically very costly to tell the truth about different groups. So you create an alliance, and you've got a barrier, and rivals can't penetrate. Right? So this is not about the inherent vulnerability, sanctity, or marginal nature of any of these protected groups. It is a strategic way of developing an ally so that you can have power, money, and prestige. So if you make any critique of certain groups, Jews, blacks, gays, Muslims, right, that's an attack on an entire alliance. And so this mobilizes members of the ruling elite to defend the victim if they have no personal connection to the group. So the no-fly zone is a defensive perimeter. And enforcing no-fly zones is a way to test and ensure transitivity, right? That means if you are my ally, you must share all my allies and all my enemies. And if you then criticize a sacred group, you're signaling that you are not an ally. You are a liability. And so we must harshly punish you, because we must purge unreliable allies who might otherwise side with a rival or start infighting. So we defend groups from critique while aggressively criticizing and critiquing enemy groups. Right? Moral principles tend to just be ad hoc, post hoc justifications, and you're incentivized to support a no-fly zone for your own ally while going to the barricades to criticize and demean and tear down the enemy. So you develop a no-fly zone, You claim high status position for your group, and then you use that power to demand resources and political concessions. We make these moral condemnations not because we're good or interested in what is good, but to punish our enemies and to empower our friends. Right? This is a way of saying, I've chosen a side and I will punish anyone who opposes us. And this then changes a way that people process truth. You have all these supposedly sacred groups, marginalized groups, Jews, blacks, gays, lesbians, Muslims, etc. They become sacralized, they become protected from criticism and critique. And if you were protected from criticism and critique, would that be a strong force in your life to make you finer and kinder and more effective? No, people will take advantage. So we have all these nested speech codes that function as social gatekeeping to uphold a certain social hierarchy where you have a certain elite on top willing to make alliances with people down below so that they can have power, prestige, and access to sex. So you have groups that are exempt from standard criticism, investigation, analysis. So you've created incentive structures for journalists, for academics, for public intellectuals to just take it easy on certain groups, right? Put a higher value on safety and status over truth and accuracy. So you've got a feedback loop where uncomfortable data points are ignored because you don't want to be a heretic. So you have a fractured information landscape where the official narrative diverges dramatically from observed reality.
Heavy faculty involvement in those protests. The faculty in many ways instigated and managed them. And so, yes, it created a very hostile environment, so hostile to the extent that an undergraduate student who's now serving 4 years in prison made open, violent threats against the kosher dining hall and Jewish students on campus. We infamously had the professor who at a rally not that long after October 7th said he felt exhilarated when he heard about it. It was a very toxic environment. I'd say it's calmed down in the past year because the administration finally started enforcing the rules. And what I've always said is you don't need new rules for these students, the anti-Israel students. You just need to enforce the same rules everybody else lives by. I'm not seeking extra punishment for them. But we have rules. You can't march through the library with a bullhorn and disrupt everybody. But that when that's applied to them, they say, oh, you're violating our free speech. No, we're just applying the rules evenly. You can't blockade doors. You can't blockade buildings. You can't do all those things. And
yeah, I didn't get why the pro-Hamas, anti-Israel crowd was allowed to shut down the effective functioning of major universities. You can't allow groups to take over property and a business. Just think of universities as a business. You can't allow groups to take over a business and not allow people access to the business. People who are paying for the business should be allowed to go to class. And this is clearly an assault on the operation of universities as a business.
So that was the pattern of intimidation. Rallies on campus. We had our encampment as well, like many other colleges did. And so that really is.
You can't allow encampments. It just encourages the worst type of
We are
behavior.
back with Victor Davis Hanson. In his own words, I'm Jack Fowler. I am hosting
Zimmerman case in Florida, where George Zimmerman correctly and properly invoked self-defense in the shooting of Trayvon Martin. And it was that case that gave rise to the Black Lives Matter hashtag. We also then covered in 2014 the Michael Brown shooting, the so-called hands up, don't shoot shooting. That case gave rise to the formal organization. So we were tracking Black Lives Matter really before it was even Black Lives Matter, that whole movement and the people involved. And we covered very closely at the website the Michael Brown case. And for those of the listeners and viewers who don't know, hands up, don't shoot never happened. It's a fabrication. The Obama Justice Department, not the Trump, the Obama Justice Department reviewed that, investigated it.
Right. So when you sacralize certain groups and say they should be exempt from criticism, right, and institutions say these groups, these topics are sacred, they are beyond criticism and analysis, right, you create this huge gap between official narratives and the lived experiences of millions of Americans. And you destroy trust. You destroy social cohesion and trust in America's institutions. So we have all these elites trying to suppress wrongthink. And overwhelmingly, elites are far more supportive of censorship of speech than ordinary Americans. And they claim they do it in the name of emotional safety, but there's no way they can eliminate these nasty thoughts, these forbidden thoughts. They just drive people who have these thoughts into nihilistic, content-neutral conspiracism. When elites won't engage with the truth, when elites won't talk about the complexities of group differences or the trade-offs of immigration, then they cede the territory to people like Nick Fuentes and Tucker Carlson. Right? People gravitate towards people who articulate their taboo experience of life. It's not because they necessarily agree with Tucker or Nick, but they feel that the active violation of these taboos about speech feels honest. And if the institutions that dominate America are putting out lies and promoting moral panics, then it's likely that forbidden information is true. So reality is porous. We're all affected by each other. When I started feeling vulnerable, then my attitude towards Greenland and Trump's threats completely changed. The Buffett identity is a useful fiction for the highly educated and the elite, but in turbulent, dangerous times, we all tend to have a keener sense of our own vulnerability, and so we see this widespread shift all across the political spectrum, from left to right, from delusions about living a Buffett identity to the acceptance that we have porous and reactive identities. And when people feel that what is true and what is not true is being managed by an elite class who's not interested in truth, but is being managed in an elite class's interest, then the elite lose the buffer of institutional trust. And now people become prone and porous to any narrative that challenges the elites and challenges the status quo and challenges the institutions, no matter how wild and crazy sounding, because it just feels more true than what the institutions are saying. Right? Holocaust denial is not about the Holocaust primarily, usually. Right? It's more about a general commitment to a middle finger to authority. Right? If people in charge say the moon landing happened and the Holocaust happened, right, a person who's lost trust in our institutions will reflexively doubt both. So the no-fly zones established around sacred groups catalyzes this total epistemic breakdown. And those with the least invested in society, who have the least in their lives, who are building the least, who have the least reason to feel optimistic about the future, are going to seek out excitement and provocation and conspiracy precisely because of the enormous disconnect they feel between what the elite institutions tell them and their own reality of life. And if this group become the kingmakers in national elections, then our whole system would be forced to bend towards their low IQ discussions, which will not please Nathan Kaufman. So we have this feedback loop. We have elite institutions trying to clamp down on speech. They're battling rising hate and misinformation by trying to expand sacralization and no-fly zones. And the more they do this, the more they validate the conspiracists' claim that the system is lying to them. So we are minimizing any possibility of some kind of shared truth-based public square. And I enjoy provoking, right? I spent my life provoking. When I provoke people, it makes me feel excited. It makes me feel superior. But I finally had a therapist get through to me. He said, Luke, when you unnecessarily provoke people, you hurt them. So the more connected and happy I feel, you feel, the more precious our lives, the more we have going on for us in our lives, the more love we have, the more family and friends and community and good things, the more optimistic we are, then naturally you're going to take more care, you're going to be more careful and more considerate in your choices because you don't want to say or do anything that might hurt those you love. On the other hand, if you have nothing precious in your life, if you're not going anywhere, you're not invested in your community, then you're very likely to find it tremendously exciting to burn everything down.
They wanted to try to get that policeman if they could, and they said they couldn't because it was a legally justified shooting. He was not. There's no credible evidence. Michael Brown had his hands up saying don't shoot. All the credible evidence, including the forensics and the ballistics and the gunpowder on his hand, showed that Michael Brown was shot because he sucker punched a policeman sitting in his patrol car, reached in and tried to grab his gun, was shot the first time, and then there was a second shot. So Black Lives Matter was created from a fabrication. And I can't say this enough.
So what do you do if you live an elite life, you're highly educated, you've got family, friends, community, you've got a lot to lose, and to maintain the wonderful things in your life, you have to give public assent to lies. It's not easy to navigate that challenge. Some people don't find living by lies as easy as other people. So what happens is you get something called preference falsification. So in public, you affirm the lies. You affirm, oh, this group is sacred. It must be off limits to any kind of normal social critique and criticism. And you have to do that to maintain your standing in polite society and keep your job, keep your family, keep your spouse, keep your position at synagogue or church. But in private, right, you look for ways to share forbidden truths. And this gap grows between your private beliefs and your public expressions. And this destroys social trust. When people realize that the public square forbids many truths, they stop trusting the information that comes from the public square. They stop trusting the institutions that manage the public square, and they look for alternative sources of information. And if you can't criticize a group, you can't critique a group, if you can't analyze a group, if you can't do the normal kind of reportage and study that a group should expect, then all sorts of maladaptive trends within that group are likely to flourish, because we all tend to do that which is easy. And it's only when we're caught out and embarrassed, right? I like to do things a certain way that are just naturally flow from my heart, and my father would shake his head when I wouldn't listen to his criticism, and he'd say to me, you'll only learn through pain. And he was right. I will keep doing comfortable things that just are congenial to my personality until the price of doing those comfortable, congenial things becomes higher than the price of changing. Sometimes you'll hear a truth, you'll hear a brutal type of feedback, and it will affect you, and it will change you, and it will most likely send you in a much better direction. And what's the role of the mainstream media here? They are the primary gatekeepers of the public square. When groups become sacred, the mainstream media moves from reporting events to managing perceptions. So journalists and editors operate within a context, a professional incentive structure, and this structure rewards a certain type of moral clarity, a certain type of hero system, and it disincentivizes moral complexity and telling the truth on inopportune topics. So when it comes to reporting on these sacralized groups, the elite news media functions as gatekeepers. They will filter out data that could lead to harmful conclusions. Right? They're going to operate with institutional risk management. If they write a story highlighting negative trends within a protected group, that's very likely to lead to their professional ostracization, to an internal HR investigation, to getting fired, to losing friends, family. It's a dark path, right? We evolved to live within the middle of the tribe. So mainstream media typically adopts the victim frame or the agency-free narrative for these groups. Anything bad that Jews, blacks, Muslims, gays do, it's not their fault. It's because of external systems. While any success from these groups, well, that's because there's something wonderful about these groups. So you have a flattened reporting. You have people being turned into static symbols in this moral political drama that intoxicates our elites. And to have these widespread preference falsifications within the newsroom, it's not good for morale, right? When the things that you observe in reality, when the data that you learn contradicts the official editorial line and the cost of speaking up is high, you'll lose your job, you'll lose your status, you'll lose your friends, you will most likely choose a spiral of silence. Only the approved narrative is voiced, even if most of the reporters privately know that it's false. This results in that knowledge falsification. The media stops reporting many things, stops gathering certain types of information because they know that information can never be published. And the elite news industry has effectively blinded itself deliberately to avoid seeing what it is not allowed to see and say. It's just like closing one eye to anything that's inconvenient. This then creates an erosion in public trust. The audience consistently experiences a huge gap between their lived reality and the media's portrayal of that reality. They recognize the media has become a propaganda arm of the elite rather than a neutral observer, and they stop trusting both the news media and the elite consensus behind it. And people increasingly migrate to alternative media, to podcasts, to independent platforms where these sacralized groups not as protected, where all these speech taboos are ignored. So we have a loss of the public square. We don't have any trusted mainstream arbiter of what is true. We do not operate with a common set of facts. We operate with various groups experiencing epistemic closure, right, where different segments of the population live in entirely different tunnels of reality. And the harder the elites and the media try to protect the sacralized groups, the more cynical the public becomes. And even true and necessary defenses of these groups will become dismissed as regime speak. So the mainstream media experiences a steadily shrinking audience, a narrowing of its intellectual horizon. By exempting various sacred groups from criticism, the media abdicates on its role as an investigator of truth, and instead it becomes a curator of social harmony in alignment with one particular hero system.
The entire launch of Black Lives Matter was based on a fabrication about the Trayvon Martin case, that it was a racist case, and a fabrication about the Michael Brown shooting. And so from its infancy, Black Lives Matter was based on a fabricated narrative of racism in our society. The people who organized the formal organization we followed from beginning, and they were self-proclaimed Marxists. They used that organization to try to destroy our society.
So have you ever heard of the Ferguson effect? Guess what? People react to incentives. And when you incentivize the police not to do their jobs, then they will back off. And when the police back off in certain communities, bad people will step up. When good people step down, bad people step up. So the Ferguson effect says that if you incentivize the police, if you direct a torrent of unfair and bad publicity to the police for enforcing the law, then they'll stop enforcing the law, they will depolice, and as a result, you'll get an astronomical rise in violent crime, which is accountable for thousands of unnecessary deaths in America since the summer of George Floyd in 2020. So the news media doesn't talk about group-level disparities in crime rates because they don't want to stigmatize a sacred group. So you have an epistemic gap. The public sees rising crime, and they see a certain sacred group responsible for much of that crime. And then when they tune into the news provide explanations completely untethered from reality. Look at St. Cloud, Minnesota. It, for decades and decades, had very low crime rates. Now crime rates are escalating. Why? Who moved into St. Cloud, Minnesota and started committing a whole ton of crime? But if you talk about that, you would violate the taboo. You would violate that Somali immigrants are a protected group. So we have to emphasize the struggles of Somali immigrants. And you have to make them exempt from the same type of civic criticism that legacy Americans face. You have COVID hitting, and public health leaders and politicians and the elite media didn't have credibility with many Americans. So you had anti-lockdown protests by Christians. These were public health threats. But protests for racial justice, these were essential to public health. So people realized that public health wasn't truly dedicated to public health. It was primarily dedicated to a certain type of political moral agenda. And that the science is just another tool for social engineering and for the advancement of people with one type of hero system rather than the objective measurement of, say, viral transmission. So people then become more broadly skeptical about Medicaid, because you get all these stories in the mainstream media about how extending Medicaid saves lives, Obamacare saves lives. But if you look at it more realistically, there's not much evidence that expanding Medicaid saves lives. Right? The truth is not on that side. So your lived experience consistently contradicts the narrative that you get from CBS News and the New York Times and from your boss and from our dominant institutions, and you will feel epistemic alienation, right? You're not just simply disagreeing. You feel that what your own eyes see and your own ears hear, you're being told that these are not reliable witnesses to reality. and you're not allowed to discuss publicly all these observed trends. Not allowed to be real about changes in neighborhood safety, or which groups are committing the most types of fraud in which areas. Not allowed to talk about the mixed effects of immigration, or the realities of different groups have different gifts, and when different groups live in the same place, there's often friction. So do you retreat into a state of chronic cognitive dissonance, or do you just get the clarity, hey, they've been lying to me? And either way, it must be an incredibly discombobulating effect, right? You realize all the incentives to just stay silent publicly with regard to the truth. You start feeling that your country is run by a hostile elite, right? You resent, and so you find fringe communities or radical politics that support your resentment. You stop trying to communicate with the mainstream. You give up. You exit many public spaces. You exit the shared public information space. You build parallel realities online where taboos are ignored. You stop giving legitimacy to elites, institutions, and the media. We get an increasingly fractured society. Trust becomes increasingly scarce. So you have all these no-fly zones creating a disorienting effect that eventually gives way to a very hard cynicism. People assume that every official statement is a lie, is some kind of move in a status game. It's a ploy. It's not an attempt to describe the truth or to describe what is good. So people discover one specific systemic lie maintained by an elite institution. They don't tend to stop at moderate skepticism. They frequently undergo a total epistemic shift. Right? They go from, I disagree with this policy, to people in charge are fundamentally lying to me. And this cascades and touches every area of institutional authority. So people stop giving leaders and experts the benefit of the doubt. They stop giving institutions the benefit of the doubt. People start thinking, what's the hidden agenda here whenever the elite speak? People recognize that mainstream narratives are carefully curated fictions. They feel betrayed, and they hunger for alternative explanations. And they think, oh, if the elites lie about group differences, then what else are they lying to me about? And people start reverse engineering reality. So the media says X, Y must be the truth. So people become more and more susceptible to conspiracy theories and fringe narratives because the official version of events is clearly a fiction. You have a flattening of the world. People stop distinguishing between different types of institutional claims. They start treating a weather report, an economic statistic, a report on international war with the same level of cynical dismissal, right? This is epistemic secession. The individual no longer lives in the same world as the elite. They view the ruling class not as fellow citizens with different ideas and values, but as a hostile, predatory layer of society that uses language primarily as a weapon of control.
It doesn't mean everybody who's gone to a march is a Marxist, but it does mean that the people behind it, the people who organized it, did it for the purpose of destroying our country. And we saw that unfold post-George Floyd. So my big takeaway is the single most influential and impactful social movement of this century in the United States was birthed from fabricated claims of racism. And people need to understand that. It was all.
And when people realize that, they don't tend to react moderately. Right? The longer the elite maintain a lie, deny the focus and effect, the more the public comes to believe that the lie is the only thing that the elite produce. So you have a collapse of trust. Very difficult to reverse because any attempt by the elite to tell the truth is now just seen as another layer of lies. And this frequently fuels an intense form of antipathy towards Jews. Right, when elites create no-fly zones around certain groups, such as Jews, they inadvertently trigger more cynicism and fear and concern and hatred towards Jews. Right? When there's an enormous gap between reality and the official narrative, you look for the architect of that deception. Jews are overrepresented in many elite sectors, such as media, law, academia. And so all sorts of no-fly zones are now attributed to Jews. This creates the trope, Jews are the state within the state. These are the people who really run things. They're manipulating public discourse to protect their own interests. And the protection of other groups, such as blacks and gays and Muslims, that's not the genuine moral project. That's just a strategic shield deployed by Jewish elites, a hostile elite to maintain their own power. Then people start looking at anti-discrimination laws and speech codes as Why are they more aggressively enforced when they involve charges of anti-Semitism as opposed to anti-Christianity or anti-white? So why these double standards? Here we've got empirical proof of a hierarchy of protection, and my group is way down on the hierarchy. Why are these various outgroups way up in the hierarchy of protection? Then you have heavy-handed measures by institutions and police and politicians and societies to combat anti-Semitism. And instead of reducing the hate, right, these actions just convince observers all the more that it's the Jews who are running things, who get unfair and special levels of state protection. If then we have more and more hatred of Jews, so we have to then get more and more laws about curtailing free speech, then people often will blame the Jews for the loss of our fundamental democratic rights. So all these elite efforts to protect Jews usually ends up providing the very ammunition used to attack Jews. Jews seem to most people to be white and elite. So why do they get this status as a protected minority? So this dual status is combustible. And if you feel victimized by the current social order, the current hierarchy, the current arrangement of institutions, current arrangement of power, then Jews seem like the most powerful segment of an undeserving, hostile elite. And if you're not allowed to critique Jews, blacks, Muslims, gays, and other sacred groups, when you're not allowed a cold analysis of reality, then you have to go underground and find radical spaces to talk about these things that interest you. And so you get a dangerous feedback loop. The more the elite attempt to protect Jews through the sacralization of Jews and the silencing of critics, the more they validate the view that Jews control the boundaries of what can be said. So Jews become the target for anyone who feels governed by a hostile and dishonest elite. So the modern no-fly zones are the modern version of the Hays Code. But instead of banning immorality or profanity, right, the current unwritten code restricts the depiction of truth with regard to certain sacred groups, which completely alters the mechanics of storytelling, character development, movies, TV shows, and audience engagement.
Well, it wasn't a hoax in the sense that two people were shot and they were killed, but they were not racially motivated shootings, and they were legally justifiable shootings. And so that's my big takeaway, is that Black Lives Matter then literally destroyed our country after George Floyd. All of the plans they had to burn down our cities and tear up campuses and force out conservatives, etc., came to fruition. And it came to fruition at Cornell also, because after the George Floyd death, I saw people marching saying, "Hands up, don't shoot." And I wrote a post at my blog, which I'd written actually 3 or 4 times before. I say, hey, that's a fabrication.
So when movies, TV shows, news reports, books stop reflecting the reality of the world as we experience it and as we see it, then these mediums lose any power to build a common culture. So we no longer have a shared mirror. We just have another contested territory where the correct portrayal of a group is more important than the quality of the film. So, for example, there's a trend, particularly I think on CBS, that the computer scientist and the medical scientist and the hero doctor, they're like 90% of the time they're black. And you see this woke agenda in your movies, and it's not so fun and entertaining. And what happens when you have an elite man with an elite education, an elite status, right? And he realizes he can't work in his elite profession as long as he tells the truth. So he has to choose between telling the truth and maintaining his position and maintaining his family. When he realizes this, is he just going to be chill about it? Right? No, he's going to have a psychological and professional crisis. He's going to find himself stuck in a pincer movement between his internal integrity and his external obligations. That's not a fun place to be. He is going to experience a high status trauma that will lead to deep resentment and very likely a radical break from the system. Right? Think about the man. He picks up Kevin McDonald's culture of critique and he starts talking about it publicly and speculating about it. And so he gets fired from his tenure position at a university. And think about the pain of his family and his friends and his community, and his life spirals. And do you think he's just going to be chill and moderate? No, you're going to have a very intense reaction to that. So if you have to choose between living in truth and providing for your family, you're going to feel emasculated, right? In a traditional view, right, your role as a man is to provide and protect for your family. So when the price of providing and protecting for your family is publicly performing lies, you will feel you've had to sell your soul to pay your mortgage. You're not going to be calm and accepting about this. It's a state of chronic stress, right? The man knows if he speaks the truth, he will get the professional death penalty. He'll be blacklisted. He will lose his health insurance. He won't be able to pay for his home. He won't be able to pay for his kids' education. And he likely see his family not so much as a source of joy and pride, but as a set of hostages held by the regime to ensure his silence. So in ancient times, when you had warring groups, they would try to reach peace by exchanging children and taking effectively hostages. And that's what we have now with this current regime. So you invest decades in acquiring the credentials and the social capital necessary for your profession. Then you realize those assets depend on your willingness to lie. Right? You're going to have a sunk cost betrayal. You'll keep going to the office, you'll attend the meetings, you'll say what you need to say, but you will become a ghost in your own life. You will practice inner emigration. Right? That's what dissident Soviet Union used. You will physically stay in your elite position, but you will mentally withdraw. And every time you sign a document or give a presentation or sign on to anything that you know is a lie, your self-respect takes a hit. You're not going to be chill about that. You will be angry, irritable, depressed, desperate, and feel a quiet, burning anger directed at the elite you once respected and wanted to emulate. And eventually, for many, this tension becomes unsustainable. You reach a breaking point. The psychological cost of the lie eventually outweighs the financial cost of the truth, and you snap. You speak out, and you do it with a ferocity. You don't do it in a chill, calm manner. You become an effective critic of the system. You know how the machinery of the lie works from the inside. Other people don't quit. They become mercenaries. They stop believing in the mission or any greater good. They focus entirely on extracting as much wealth as possible before the system collapses. They become cynical players who have no loyalty to society or to the elite class they inhabit. Right? When you are lying to protect your family, you live in a permanent state of dread. You're constantly looking over your shoulder. You're constantly wondering, will this stray comment or this private email or this remark, will it trigger the HR mechanism that ends my career? You're not going to be chill. You will be a man living in a gilded cage, watching the door, waiting for the lock to turn. Think about the pressure of living this double life. Creates a corrosive atmosphere that will leak into the most intimate parts of your life. You suppress the truth at work to protect your status, but you don't leave that tension at the office. You will bring home a version of yourself that is guarded, resentful, and distant. I can't imagine that this is good for marriages.
Okay, and people lost their minds. There was a concerted effort, internet petitions, 15 student groups organized a boycott of my course. Every professor in my hallway signed a letter denouncing me. The dean denounced me. All this craziness, all because I told the truth about this fraudulent movement, this movement founded based on.
So what do you think this does to a marriage? Right? The spouse is the first casualty. The spouse is going to cry herself to sleep every night. Now, perhaps if the wife shares his private views but still insists on public compliance for the sake of their life and their kids, right? Then they become co-conspirators in a lie. They have a shared burden. They can develop a bunker mentality, but what will more likely happen is mutual contempt. He will resent her for being the reason that he must kneel to the regime. She loses respect for him because he's emasculated. The home is no longer a sanctuary of truth. It becomes a second theater where the correct opinions must be managed to avoid social suicide. Think about the effect on the children. Will the father raise his children to be truth tellers or survivors? If he teaches them the truth, they may repeat it at school and ruin his life and their lives. If he teaches them the elite narrative, he is lying to his own flesh and blood. Children are sensitive to authenticity. When they sense that their father is saying one thing and believing another, they lose their moral North Star. They may grow up to be cynical chameleons who believe that all speech is just a tool for status. They may rebel against his weakness and cowardice. Not good. Think about the man's friendships and his church. right? These things are usually built on shared values, but now the no-fly zone turned them into minefields. Socializing becomes an exercise in constant self-censorship. Like every time you go to dinner, it's like the company dinner. You have to avoid old friends who are true believers in the elite narrative because the effect of performing the elite narrative for them is just too exhausting. He gravitates towards a smaller, hushed circle of men who know that even there, the fear of a league prevents honesty. Think about the empty pew. If his church adopts the sacralized language of the day of social justice and diversity mandates, the man will feel spiritually betrayed. He sees that the one place that should be dedicated to eternal transcendent truth has been captured by the same lies he has to tell at work. So he's probably not going to last long in this church. He's going to withdraw and feel that his friends and his community are truly a surveillance network. So the final state is one of profound isolation. A man feels he cannot be fully known by anyone, not his wife, not his kids, not his peers. I mean, good luck telling your therapist these things. He becomes a unit of one. He has to protect a secret reality of truth that no one else is allowed to see. Right? And this atomization is the goal of the system of lies that uses these sacralized groups to enforce speech codes. It breaks any bonds between people, leaves them isolated. There's no one to trust but the state and the institutions that manage this lying narrative. So the elite man realizes he's been lied to. He realizes he will lose his family and his social standing and his home and his community if he pursues truth. He's not likely to be chill and cool about it.
On fabrications. And so I'm very familiar with BLM. I've been following it forever. I'm never going to stop speaking out and letting people know that it was based on a fabrication.
Terrific work done by Legal Insurrection on that. Now, I'm going to read an ad. Before I do,
all right, so next up now, my reported monologue. I'm here on a regular basis to try to explain Donald Trump. I'm not here to defend him. I'm not here to attack him. There are tens of millions of people in America who love the guy and tens of millions who do not like him at all. And I feel like my job is to try to explain him. I've known him not well, but well enough for a long time. And that is part of my formal job, is to report on Donald Trump, and has been now for over a decade. It's an interesting story. As a journalist, he's a compelling character. And I think even the people who disdain him the most would have to acknowledge that this is a key story. But I also feel like there's a vacuum. If you read the media, talk to Trump supporters, talk to his detractors, I find you rarely get a clear sense of what he's like. And this Greenland fight, which is dominating not just the news, but what's going on all this week in Davos with Europe and the United States really disagreeing. Part of the fight's about the president's announcement about new tariffs, but also his threat that he's going to take Greenland the easy way or the hard way. Markets around the world are rattled. As I record this today, people are really concerned about the economic impact here. And European allies and American defenders of Europe are stunned. So what I'm going to try to do today is to take the reporting I've done since this began and match it up with the reporting I've done with Donald Trump over a decade. This is a real thing. This is a real fight. This is not trolling by Donald Trump, although it is that too. It's not just trolling. And this is not going to go quietly away. Some of the people in the commentariat are saying that this is going to rip the NATO alliance apart, that the threats that the president, Vice President Vance, others in the administration and Trump allies have made against NATO, that it has to change, are nothing compared to this fight. And you are already seeing some remarkable things. NATO countries sending military force to Greenland, they say to show that they can defend it, but clearly it's meant to send a signal. The release of private communications between the president and NATO allies by both those allies and by the president himself. Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary in Davos, saying everybody needs to take a deep breath and kind of mocking Europe and warning them not to escalate things. People are saying on the left who don't like the president, who are very upset, and you shouldn't, if you love what the president's doing and threatening Europe and threatening Denmark and Greenland, you should understand that a lot of your fellow Americans are very upset by this. And we've talked on two-way, and I've talked elsewhere to Trump supporters who do not like this. And the polls are clear. The polls are overwhelming. We talked about that last week. The polls are overwhelming. People don't want a military takeover, and they're not that keen on some sort of forced takeover of what's happening. So the White House is not in a panic over this. And in fact, Bessent and the president both continue, Secretary Rubio, brimming with confidence. While the markets have taken a hit, there's not, at least again, as of today, a full-off panic. But people are wondering about the NATO alliance. And the New York Times is asking apocalyptically whether this could represent the end of the alliance as has been known to exist, defending the West. NATO has been a valuable part of world security and American security for a long time. So there's no doubt that this is a serious thing, and there's no doubt that people are both cheering the president on in some quarters and rooting against him in others and angry at him in others. And the Europeans are divided. A lot of them are talking publicly and privately about trying to work something out. But they're worried that it won't work out and that this will be some sort of permanent rupture. So this is what I want to tell you, 5 points about where this actually is. The president knows the Europeans are upset, but he wants Europe to change. And you saw this when he demanded in the first term that Europe pay their fair share regarding NATO. But you also saw it in the vice president's speech at the beginning of the Trump administration. They look at old Europe as just that, as old, and that their failure to modernize their economies, their societies, their militaries, he looks at that as a reason to act, and he thinks that gives him room to act with impunity. That Europe is slow, that it's process obsessed, that it's afraid of using hard power. And when Scott Bessent mocks Europe, as he did in Davos, for maybe they'll react by forming a working group, that's not an accident. That's meant to send a signal that what Trump and Bessent and Rubio and Vance all believe is that Europe can't respond quickly, that Europe cannot escalate things quickly, and they've got nowhere to go but to deal with the United States. And the irony, from the point of view of many people around the president who I've talked to, is that who played footsie with Putin and with China over the last decades? Not the United States more than Europe. Europe became reliant on Putin's oil and stayed reliant on Putin's oil, even after he invaded Ukraine the first time, even after it was clear that he was a bad actor. They have established deep economic ties with Xi. You saw the Canadian Prime Minister meeting with Xi this week. Their view is, the Team Trump speaking to Europe, you all have done nothing to check Putin. You've done nothing to check Xi. You're reliant on the United States, and yet you take the easy way out on economics by doing business with those two countries. And whether it's trade or energy or security or Ukraine, from Donald Trump's perspective, Europe needs to change. And while he's doing this effort to get Greenland on the merits, which we've discussed here, about security, having a missile shield, and about the shipping lanes, and about the rare earth minerals, they also see this as an opportunity to try once again to get Europe to come into the modern world. And a lot of people in this country, a lot of the people in the national security establishment, they bristle at that. They want Europe to be, considered an equal partner in this alliance, and that's just not how Team Trump thinks about it. All right, second point I want to talk about is I've been reading a lot of people who are against Donald Trump who say, this is it, this is different. Trump's lost his mind. He's connecting the failure to get a Nobel Prize with his efforts to get Greenland and to not.
Okay, so if you're not happy with the elite, not happy with the mainstream media, you're going to turn to alternative sources of information. What could be a better alternative source of information than modern wisdom? The great thing about trafficking and teaching and sharing and monetizing wisdom is that it can't be refuted, right? It just makes a bunch of unverifiable claims. I enjoy some of the Modern Wisdom show with Chris Williamson, and he engaged in forbidden conversation, right? We've got a forbidden conversation space here about men and masculinity and men's problems, right? And this is Chris Williamson speaking to that edgy academic who is being upheld as the voice for men who feel alienated, Scott Galloway.
This was the correct interpretation of the selfish gene as well. That is the message of it, that you are not a prisoner to selfish genes anymore.
Yeah. Even Richard Dawkins.
Right, you've heard that there are forbidden truths in evolutionary psychology. Well, here you go.
Sure.
Even Richard Dawkins.
Back
Back in the 1970s Like he emphasized that many times. Anyway,
I know.
still didn't
I know.
get it.
Okay.
It didn't do any good. It didn't prevent it all going wrong.
I mean, it didn't
nevertheless.
prevent him from giving terrible tips as well,
No,
but
it did not.
never mind. So here we go.
And as any evolutionary psychologist will tell you, if you have an imbalanced sex ratio, the power is with the rarer sex. And because of women's selection preference and this rising up through the socioeconomic ladder, they have created an imbalanced sex ratio to the benefit of.
So all these very successful talkers, they just sound so good. They sound so confident. They're so superficially conversant on such a wide variety of topics of which they know very little.
Of ultra high performing men who use and discard, don't commit,
Portia polygamy,
play the game.
Yeah. And what some of the research shows is the following: is that a lack of a romantic relationship. There's a cartoon of a woman in her 30s. Like one of the biggest tragedies in the world is a woman in her 30s who hasn't found romantic love or a partner. She's alone. She's living with cats on a rainy day in a big sweater, staring out the window, thinking about what could have happened if she'd only found love. And her parents feel like they've failed and society has failed her. The reality is men need relationships more than women. And that if you look at the data around what happens when a young woman doesn't have the benefit of a romantic.
Whenever I hear these talking heads say, look at the data, right, I reach for my spiritual revolver of skepticism.
Relationship, she oftentimes pours that energy back into her friends and her professional life. Men oftentimes, not all men, but a lot of men or more men pour that energy back into unproductive things. They go deeply online. They're more prone to conspiracy theory. 1 in 3 men who don't either cohabitate with a woman or aren't married by the time they're 30, there's a 1 in 3 chance they're going to be a substance abuser. Widows.
Right, he just tosses off these facts that sound so powerful, but are they true?
Now, Chris, did you fact check this one? I think that's basically right. The thing that he says at the end there, that men whose partners die, who are widowers or get divorced, or in fact are single generally, I think they're much worse off than their partnered brethren. That's what I vaguely recall.
Yes, they're much worse off, but I mean, much. You got to quantify it, right? But the 1 in 3.
Like it's not radical, and obviously some people are very happy being single. But just I think this is.
I would suspect, and I've certainly seen that in my own life, the more I care about myself, and I tend to care about myself to the degree to which I notice other people care about me, and other people care about me to the degree to which I contribute to their lives. So if you are high functioning, you likely contribute to the lives of other people in important ways. They therefore will care about you, and you will naturally care about yourself, and you will therefore engage in self-care. Self-care is the symptom. What's really going on is competence. Do you matter in the lives of other people?
Statistics are that it's basically right that men don't do quite as well being single or divorced or whatever as women.
Yeah, although, so directionally the claims are correct, but every time I looked into a figure that they cited, trying to find the study that it related to or the headline or whatever, it was basically always overstated or made more hyperbolic. Like the claim here.
Oh my God, you mean people overstate and exaggerate things to create more emotionally pleasing narratives to grab more attention, like all the European politicians hyperventilating over Donald Trump's threats to Greenland? Are they going to get status and prestige from being calm? No, you get status and prestige and at least reaction and attention by being hyperbolic.
Is 1 in 3 unmarried or not cohabitating men are having some substance abuse, right? And again, when I looked into that, it wouldn't surprise me at all that the rate is higher, right? For unmarried men, for lots of reasons, including just that, rates of alcoholism and stuff go down whenever people are in marriages.
Yeah, rates are higher for men across the board, right?
Also, it's a lot easier to get married if you're not an alcoholic, right? If you're high functioning, you're going to have a much easier time connecting with other people. If you're a marginalized loser who isn't adding value to other people's lives, you're going to be isolated and I would expect fairly miserable. So you recognize these no-fly zones, that various sacralized groups are exempt from criticism. You recognize that the system is frequently lying to you, and you are very likely to transition, not from male to female, but from being someone who feels a stakeholder in the elite system. You now feel like an outlier, and you're in the process of psychological disintegration, right? You're not going to be cool about this. You'll be in a state of high alert survivalism. You understand that your social standing and your ability to earn a living and to maintain status is not just a badge of success, right? It is the very coating that keeps you and your family safe and your life intact. That coating begins to crack because you can no longer swallow the official lies, the official narratives. Then you're going to undergo a profound internal crisis. You're going to lose any sense of safety in your own home, in your own work, in your own church. You'll start to see your spouse and your children as the leverage, the hostages that the regime uses against you. You'll experience a spiritual claustrophobia. You know that a single honest remark, right, could trigger a whole process of social liquidation. You'll effectively be sent off to the gulag and separated from your family and friends. You'll watch your words at the breakfast table just as carefully as you do in the boardroom or the faculty lounge. You'll feel an increasing wall of static between yourself and the people that you love the most. You'll be physically present, but mentally you'll feel like you're an operative in enemy territory, operating by Moscow rules, constantly scanning for threats. You'll sense you'll be less effective, less happy. Less happy people are usually less effective. Your social standing will slip. You'll mourn what you once had. You'll lose your elite status. You used to think you're on the winning side of history. Now you're losing. You feel illegitimate in the eyes of your peers. You see the look in the eyes of your old friends, mixture of pity and fear. Start realizing that your old friends now view you as a contagion. They don't want to be near you. They don't want to talk to you. Your honesty is a threat to their own stability and status. So you will isolate. You're very likely to develop cold, hard resentments. You don't just disagree with the elites. You begin to hate them for the cowardice that you see in them, in yourself, in other people. And you're much more likely to shift into the Nick Fuentes burn it all down mentality, right? You start to accept my old life is gone. I've got nothing left to lose. The fear is gone, and it's now replaced by a dangerous clarity. You don't care about the no-fly zones because you live in the crash zone. This is where you become most effective and most unpredictable. You've moved from being a managed subject to an independent actor with nothing left to lose, like Michael Douglas' character in Falling Down. You might be broke, you may be divorced, you may be an outcast, but officially, for the first time, you feel an integrated person who respects and lives by the truth. Yeah, you've been divorced and fired, but at least you see through the bullshit.
Yes, rates of men are higher across the board. And actually, I found a study that was looking at alcohol use disorder, right? So just on alcohol in the US across lifetime and in the past 12 months. And with men across the lifetime, the overall rate was 36%. Okay, 1 in 3. But that includes like mild, moderate, severe. And by marital status, so it was 35% amongst the never married. Amongst the married, it was 27.2. Okay, so like it is lower, but Scott gives the impression almost that it's almost non-existent, right? Like unless you're not in that relationship. Widowed separated were on a similar rate, so it didn't really change. So the protective.
So I find it stunning how many people just find living by lies. And you may find it, oh, of course, that's how it's always been. It's how it always will be. There will always be sacred lies that you're not allowed to challenge if you want a successful, easy life. So some people are fine with living by lies. It enables them to rise to the top. Those who are not cool with living by lies, they are going to have a lot more struggle in life, right? You'll see fundamental splits in the human soul in the hierarchies of these declining institutions. People who rise to the top of institutions that push lies will be those with a high capacity for compartmentalization, a low drive for truth. They will see language as a tool for navigation rather than a mirror of reality. Saying the right thing is simply the tax that you pay to maintain your status and safety. So you'll have these high-functioning chameleons running our declining institutions, people who can easily pivot their public moral stances in a single afternoon without any sense of internal disquiet. Then there are people who just can't live by the lie. Right? They have an inability to participate in the universal lie. So for these men, the gap between what they see and what they are forced to say creates such a physical and mental friction that it becomes unbearable. And they're frequently the most competent and effective people in the room. They pay the most attention to detail. They are the best at their jobs. And it is these skills that makes them so good that make it impossible for them to ignore the data and the truth that contradicts the official lying narratives. The system prefers chameleons. The system prefers box checkers who go along to get along. The system prefers men who are willing to lie to get a promotion. The system prefers men who can be controlled. The system prefers people who lack a truth anchor that makes them predictable and loyal. A man who insists on truth is a liability. He may be brilliant, but his commitment to reality makes him wild. He cannot be bought off with a title or a bonus if the price is his integrity. So you have a negative selection process operating within our most elite professions. You have an exodus of people who love and value truth, and they will migrate to the margins, to solo practices, to alt-stack industries where the overhead of the lie is lower. You'll have rule of the mediocre, those who are the most comfortable with lies. So institutions will become less competent. If you cannot speak the truth about small things such as group performance and social friction, you eventually lose the ability to speak the truth about big things, such as market collapse and structural failure. A man who's not cool with living by lies will likely be lonely. He'll look at his peers who are lying and thriving, wonders what's wrong with me. But the reality is, he is simply refusing to pay the moral entry fee of certain lies. He is choosing the life of integrated poverty or marginalized truth over the gilded lie. And this is the defining moral struggle of the modern professional class. So in our elite universities, these sacralized groups and their accompanying no-fly zones function as the hard barrier to the pursuit of truth and the scientific method. When certain conclusions, when certain observations, when certain data is off limits, the university ceases to be a place of inquiry and truth-seeking, and it becomes a center for propaganda and narrative reinforcement. So the whole entire logic and reason and purpose for research and publishing creates a peer review that becomes really a form of ideological policing.
Effect persisted, but yeah, so like 27 to 35 is a less dramatic difference, right, than what it kind of implies when they say 1 in 3 men, because like the marriage rate is almost 1 in 3 rounded up as well.
Yeah. What about the thing at the beginning? I was a bit confused there because Chris Williamson said that women getting educated and earning more money is basically giving more power to men because now there's more women competing for fewer men. Now, I think I know what he's alluding to, but he seems to be a little bit mixed up because there's still fundamentally the same number of men and the same number of women, right?
Yeah.
So when an institution goes to war with reality, reality always wins. Our leading, most elite, most prestigious institutions are partly at war with reality and say their denial of uncomfortable group differences. And when the pursuit of truth, right, gets you fired, you're not going to have institutions pursuing truth. So the whole reason for an academy, for a university, is to follow the truth. And these no-fly zones create knowledge holes where all sorts of variables cannot be tested, observed, and discussed openly. So you have prohibited variables, prohibited parts of truth. So you have to avoid looking at group-level biological or cultural differences because the results might contradict the sacred narrative of total blank slate. Researcher finds a disparity is caused by something other than systemic bias. They must bury the data to protect their career. For a theory to be true and to be scientific, it must be capable of being proved wrong. But if criticizing or simply observing certain group behaviors is a moral taboo, then any theory that places that group in a negative light is unfalsifiable by default. You cannot prove a theory wrong if the evidence required to do that is banned. And who is going to enforce these no-fly zones? You have a growing layer of administrators who have no connection to truth or research or teaching. You have the rise of the DEI industrial complex. You have universities that put a higher priority on signaling how moral they are and how much they love impact statements and diversity statements over the pursuit of truth. And so university professors will be strongly incentivized to pursue the sacred narrative of the elite left-wing hero system rather than the pursuit of truth. And when the public realizes that the academy is more interested in putting out propaganda than in pursuing truth, the value of university credential collapses. The academy becomes an echo chamber. Everyone is afraid to trigger the no-fly zone. Discourse becomes predictable and boring. Brilliant, uncool people who want to pursue truth are pushed out or never even apply in the first place. This academic decay will drive the growth of parallel educational institutions, right? Barry Weiss University, Luke Ford show. People start looking for uncredentialed experts, independent researchers, rogue professors, data-driven bloggers. Anyone who's just willing to speak the truth, the obvious truths that are banned on campus. So the academy loses its prestige, loses its role as the engine of progress, becomes a high-priced finishing school for the managerial class, but real intellectual life is on Substack. When you have no-fly zones in the hard sciences, well, nature doesn't care about social consensus, so you have no-fly zones in medicine, engineering, and pharmacology. The cost of these noble lies will be measured in human lives and mechanical failure, not just social friction. Medical schools often admit groups with quite low test scores if it's a sacred group. They put a higher priority on this moral agenda over excellence. Certain groups become sacred, and then admissions and grading processes are adjusted to ensure representative outcomes. Then you have unqualified, incompetent people pass through the system because of their group status rather than their mastery, and so the quality of care drops. And affirmative action doctors have huge rates of getting sued for malpractice for very good reason. Patients become the ultimate victims of this epistemic compromise. Doctors are often discouraged from noting group differences in disease and drug response if these observations conflict with a narrative of blank slate. So you get a colorblind and identity-blind approach to medicine that leads to misdiagnosis and ineffective treatment protocols for the very group that this system claims to protect. In engineering, you expect that the laws of physics are the ultimate arbiters. You cannot narrative manage a bridge into staying upright or a turbine into functioning efficiently. So you get a growing competence crisis. When hiring in high-stakes engineering firms is influenced by diversity mandates rather than ability, the margin for error shrinks. The uncool man who points out that a candidate lacks the skill is called a bigot. The firm hires the safe candidate, and you have ever-increasing risks of structural failure across the entire population. Funding for hard sciences is usually tied to social impact metrics. So your grant will get rejected if you cannot explain how your work advances the status of sacred groups. So you have a diversion of cognitive resources away from innovation and towards propaganda.
It's unless you're, in China, I don't think there's a huge sex imbalance. Although I feel like if there is even a 0.1% sex imbalance, that they're going to be on top of it more than I am. Chris Williamson will be aware of it. So yeah, but so what are you suggesting he's mixing up, Matt?
Well, I think what he's trying to say, there are issues actually with actual sex imbalances in terms of people partnering up, but it's mostly felt by older women, especially, 60 plus or even 50 plus perhaps, who are in the marriage market, because men die earlier, and those that don't die don't tend to take care of themselves as well. And so I guess there is actually a genuine dearth of men in those older age brackets in terms of being available. But what he's talking about is that the downside of women having more equality, being better educated, earning more money, is that, according to Chris, I think, they will only consider men who are better educated than them or similarly, and earning more money than them or similarly. So that's what's creating.
Yeah, what's going to get more attention? The crisis in men, or the crisis in women, or the crisis of AI, or a calm approach that puts the highest priority on talking about what's true. So think about what happens when public health officials use their scientific and elite status to provide cover for political propaganda. You have a credibility death spiral. When health organizations declare systemic racism is a greater public health than coronavirus, as we saw in 2020, they're committing institutional suicide, and they get Bobby Kennedy to run the HHS. You think Bobby Kennedy would be running the HHS if we hadn't had this credibility death spiral? When our most elite public health officials tell us that truth and data is subordinate to their moral hierarchy, it doesn't increase credibility and social trust. When the public realize that the science is being massaged to avoid violating these no-fly zones, they stop following health advice altogether. And they start distrusting life-saving tech like vaccines. You would expect that the hard sciences would operate as the last line of defense for a civilization. So when people in the hard sciences are forced to choose between lies and their livelihood, the physical infrastructure of the world is going to degrade. We've moved from a society that solves problems to a society that focuses on managing the optics of their own decline. When you heard the alt-right arguing about optics, that's always a sign that you're losing. It's a focus on something that you think you can fairly easily fix, and it's just entertaining and diverting away from the painful truth that you're losing. The optics cucks. So we have a competence crisis. We have a slow motion collapse of systems that we used to respect. We have elite technical institutions that put a higher priority on narrative management over excellence and proficiency. You have a feedback loop between observation and correction that is broken. And so we see the increasing frequency of glitches in the fundamental architecture of modern life due to these no-fly zones. Think about energy policy. It's dominated by these sacred narratives regarding the speed and ease of the transition to renewables. Not allowed to question the feasibility of these goals. That's a professional no-fly zone. So engineers are not able to speak the unvarnished truth about grid stability. Right? People with expertise know that intermittent sources of power like wind and solar cannot sustain a modern industrial grid. But to say this clearly makes you an obstructionist. So you see periodic grid failures in Texas, in California. These are not just natural disasters. They're a result of a left-wing policy agenda made by elites who ignored the warnings of uncool engineers in favor of symbolic moral victories and comforting forms of narrative propaganda. In aviation and in rail, no-fly zones are destroying safety and merit. Boeing, think about its culture and how it shifted to diversity metrics. And we got high-profile mechanical failures and quality control lapses, and the men who noticed these issues were silenced or sidelined because their whistleblowing threatened the corporate image. Federal Aviation Administration, they want to focus on affirmative action. They want to bring in more diverse air traffic controllers. They want to hire people who don't mind the lie. And the lack of competence will inevitably lead to death and destruction.
Being an imbalance in the market, which according to him is creating this situation where there are these alpha men who are in that situation that have the pick of the litter and go around like little gadflies, trifling with ladies' affections, which I'm sure Chris would not approve of.
I see. Okay, well, yes, that does make sense in terms of like what he's outlining. So, well, there you have it, Matt. So I don't have any comment on that. That's just like, okay.
I don't think I think there's multiple things wrong with that point, basically. I mean, first of all, men do still earn a lot more than women across the age groups, mainly due to women going out of the workforce when they have children. Yes, recently women are tending to be more likely to go to university, but that doesn't necessarily translate into higher average wages these days. And yeah,
So why is everything getting worse, even online? Why do updates make products worse rather than better? We have a loss of institutional memory. The older, uncool experts are pushed out. They're replaced by a cohort selected through the lens of sacralized identity rather than technical mastery. So the ability to maintain these complex legacy systems is diminishing. When a society can no longer build and maintain its own infrastructure, it's entered a state of civilizational exhaustion. competence crisis is the ultimate check on these lies. You can lie and lie and lie, but you can only lie and lie and lie about sociology for decades. You can't lie about the integrity of a bridge until the first truck crosses it. So when will the elite class acknowledge that these no-fly zones, before the physical systems they manage, reach a point of no return? When COVID hit, right, it was a high-speed particle accelerator for every horrible epistemic trend in America. The pandemic forced the no-fly zones of the social sciences into the high-stakes world of biological survival. The universal lie stopped being a theoretical problem and became a mandatory daily practice. Public health officials, already accustomed to pushing propaganda and narratives around sacred groups, started applying the same logic to COVID. And we had a great unmasking of Science Incorporated. We had a great unmasking of the American elite because they said, hey, it's fine to get together to protest on the matter of race, but it's not okay to get together to worship Jesus. So we learned the science was not some kind of objective search for truth. It was a tool of the hierarchy, right? If the virus was dangerous when anti-lockdown protesters gathered, but then the virus paused its transmission for sacred anti-racism groups, then the experts weren't scientists. They were priests of a secular religion. They were the equivalent of witch doctors, right? The uncool man sitting at home, watching his business collapse while the elites cheer on these mass anti-racism gatherings, will likely reach a point of total epistemic secession. He realizes the rules are not about his safety. He realizes the rules are about status and submission. And you had the weaponization of these no-fly zones and sacred groups through digital censorship. Silicon Valley platforms became the enforcement arm of the elite. They banned discussion of the lab leak theory or the limits of vaccine efficacy. So for an elite man in the middle of this, the pressure becomes unbearable. He has to navigate a world where his child's school is closed for 2 years. His office is a Zoom-monitored panopticon. His social standing depends on his vocal support for policies that change by the week. If he points out the mounting data on learning loss or physical toll of prolonged isolation on the elderly, he is anti-science. So the pandemic turns every home into a miniature version of a Soviet apartment where families whisper the truth in the kitchen while keeping a mask of compliance for their neighbors. So COVID-19 ensured that the competence crisis and the epistemic crisis merged into a single national trauma.
A lot of women are perfectly happy to marry someone who, I mean, I've got several colleagues actually, female colleagues, because I work with a lot of women because I'm in psychology, right? A lot of female colleagues. And so I know who their partners are. And yeah, often their partners are tradies and they'd be earning more money than them. It's just a perfect example.
Well, the conversation continues. This is a short clip, but just more evolutionary psychology statistics coming at you.
Widows are happier after their husband dies than when he was alive. Widowers, less happy, right?
I just never got the media attention and why anyone would just pay mind to Scott Galloway. I just don't see the value proposition.
Men on average in a relationship live 4 to 7 years longer. Women do live longer, but only 2 to 4 years. The reality is we as
It's a great
men,
deal.
What's that?
It's a great deal. For guys, partnership is a great deal.
So again, I just to mention, I don't doubt the direction of the effects that they're looking at, but when I went to check these statistics that they're citing so confidently, right? Like men live 4 to 7 years longer, women 2 to 4. I can't find that being a consensus view at all, right? There's different figures that are.
So my experience, the people who are the most glib and the most confident in their pronouncements tend to be the least accurate and the least dedicated to truth.
And also the thing about widowers being like more happy when their husbands die. I mean, I understand, but again, not something that you can find in the literature. There are headlines associated, with a study shows that widows were happier after, but it's like always talking about like a specific study, right? And it's not something broadly it's not like all studies show women are happier when their partners die.
Yeah.
No, they
Right, a specific low quality study in particular can just show anything. So studies say is usually an unintelligent way to discuss the truth. Right? How powerful is the study? How convincing is it?
Don't.
Yeah.
And actually, they go on to talk about the widow effect, right? Like the thing that a lot of people are more likely to die, right, after their partners die, right? And so wouldn't that contradict that kind of claim that like they're all, it's just so it's not that I'm saying all the claims that they make are wrong, but the way it feels to me is that they've basically come across a factoid that supports, the thing that they think is true. And then they put, I don't know, like a Joe Rogan cooties file or whatever. They probably have a folder or some, place where they store these articles and facts. And then they kind of memorize them and throw them out, right? And it's just completely the wrong way to approach this kind of topic. Because you could say things like, in general, men live a little bit longer whenever they're in relationships. And the effect might be slightly.
My father did this, right? My father was an influencer. He was a PhD, he was a scholar, he was an evangelist, but he was fundamentally an influencer, and he would just store up all these attention-grabbing nuggets. Didn't pay much particular attention to whether or not they were true, and then assemble them together and dispense them as though he'd come up with them all.
Less pronounced for women.
Yeah.
But that doesn't sound as scientific or compelling as the men live 4 to 7 years longer, whereas for women it's only 2 to 3. And no, but the precision that applies is not there. So it's just very frustrating because every time I checked the statistics, it was like there is some truth to this, but the confidence and the magnitude are overstated.
Yeah, this is incredibly common in Podcastistan. And it's because obviously that the reality is not super compelling or interesting, right? There are lots of little effects. Being married is in general good, but benefits might be a bit less or more, and whatever. Divorced men might have worse outcomes and whatever, but when you control for this, it's whatever. And we're talking relatively small effect sizes, and it basically doesn't amount to a compelling story. So I think what's annoying you is that what you get here is a kind of paint by numbers caricature. There's grains of truth in it, and it may sometimes be directionally correct, but the way it's framed is much bigger and brighter and provides the kind of basis for this sort of, I guess, in particular, Chris Williamson is prone to it, this sort of pseudo-evolutionary theorizing.
Yeah, and it's the same kind of approach we saw with Dr. K, with Huberman, with like any number of people in Jordan Peterson, right? It's decorative scholarship, really. Like they want to make a point and they want to throw in like studies and statistics to make that point. Now, I do think Scott Galloway, for example, is going to have hired people and, done research for his book and had, this is where probably these figures are coming from. But again, it's the wrong way to approach research literature and stuff like this, pulling out like little individual shock figures. That's why earlier, Matt, I was saying, if it's 1 woman a week or it's 10 women a week or it's, whatever the statistic is, the kind of directional thing is the more important thing than the specific statistic.
Yeah, I mean, what matters is the effect size. That's what you're getting at, right? So
yes,
I'm
exactly.
I'm being a little bit lazy with the 1 woman a week because that's obviously the reason I thought of that is that it was something that was quite widely discussed in Australia, right? As a domestic violence, but that's obviously based on the Australian population, right? You go to a bigger population, it'll be more women per week. Smaller population, less. What actually matters substantively is the effect size there, which is quite huge, right? The differential between male and female deadly violence versus the other way around, same goes for sexual violence, is quite massive. So I wouldn't quibble with their numbers if they were more than just directionally correct and more than just, oh yes, I can find some single study that found this number. But if it was a consistent, strong effect that was actually meaningful, and then it might be worth having a bit of public discussion about.
Right. And so, just to be clear, I mean, it will sound nitpicky to people.
So a normal person doesn't do what I do, right? A normal person doesn't look forward to opportunities to stand up and tell you this is how life is, this is what truth is, this is what's good, this is what's bad. Did you know this pieces of evidence? Did you know that what they're telling you is false, right? There's usually a whole lot of weirdness, trauma, and dysfunction that would drive someone to do the things that I do and the things that Scott Galloway does and Chris Williamson. So with these no-fly zones, with these sacralized groups, with this society of the lie, you get two primary responses. You get the rise of the institutionalists and the rise of the secessionists, right? We have our population splitting into two camps. If you think that America's institutions are fundamentally, with all their flaws, on your side, you vote for the Democrats. If you feel that America's institutions are fundamentally governed by a hostile elite, then you vote for Republicans. So those who believe that the current system is the only thing standing between order and chaos, the people who value the no-fly zones as necessary social guardrails, for those who respect and even worship the expert consensus, that's the ultimate source of truth, those who see dissent not as a search for truth or reality, but as a dangerous form of misinformation that threatens public safety, then you're an institutionalist who votes for the Democrats. Now, if you're part of a group that's undergone a total epistemic break, if you're effectively seeding from our institutions, if you're looking for alternative news networks for your own currencies, for your own ways of educating your kids, if you view our institutions as fundamentally hostile, if you view official statements as just moves in a status game, then you look for truth in those exact areas where the no-fly zones are most strictly enforced, such as with regard to Jews. And this creates our 2026 media landscape. If you don't trust the New York Times or CNN, you look to specific podcasters or independent journalists. And this challenges the stability of our country. The executive branch attempts to bypass traditional checks and norms and capture the machinery of government. And in response, you get the legal and social resistance from states that are not down with that. You have a competence drain. The best and the brightest and the most truth-seeking are increasingly avoiding our elite institutions. They'd prefer to have integrity and work in independent fringe spaces. So the core institutions in our country are often in the hands of people at ease with lying. So the truth becomes a black market commodity, and the people who trade in it become a separate nation within a nation. Donald Trump is elected in 2024, and he is a massive kinetic shock to our already fractured epistemic landscape. So for the institutionalist, his victory was not just a political defeat, it was a glitch in reality itself. It was a mental health crisis. Millions of people will tell you that the worst thing that ever happened to them was the election of Donald Trump. I can't imagine taking politics that seriously, that personally, but people do. And then for the secessionists, that felt like a breach in the hull of a ship that they had long considered a prison. So now we have an intensified war over no-fly zones, because Donald Trump is not always a believer in the no-fly zone over any criticism of Somalis, for example. Now we have, as President of the United States, a man who delights in trampling on no-fly zones. He is the most powerful man in the world. He is head. He's in charge of the very institutions that created our no-fly zones.
Back down, and that somehow this is some new Trump, a worse Trump than we've ever seen. No, this is not a mental health plot twist. This is vintage Trump, thinking about the old dictum, what's mine is mine, what yours will negotiate over, thinking about real estate, biggest island in the world with a strategic location. So it's a big piece of real estate in a great place, and it's about leverage. And Trump is always about leverage. He's had the same set of instincts, the same priorities for 50 years, using leverage, contempt for elite consensus, the same belief that people who go through the regular norms are suckers. Anybody who's shocked by this, anyone who thinks this represents some sort of breakdown, or that this is the thing that people in Congress, Republicans in Congress and others should be reacting to, they just haven't been paying attention. This is not change for Trump. This is continuity. The media reaction, particularly for people who don't like Trump, to say he's insane, he's destroying the left, he's a lunatic, he's a moron. It's just not different. Now, you may think all those things are true about Donald Trump, but he's acting exactly as behaved for 50 years. He wanted to take Greenland in the first term for a variety of reasons. He backed down. But this is vintage Trump, and nobody should say it's some new Trump. Okay, number 3, there is a check on Trump here. It's not Europe. It's not the Republicans in Congress. It's not the people in the United States who want to stop him from proceeding to try to take Greenland. It's the markets. If the markets react really negatively to this, Trump will always react to markets. And Scott Bessent, Marco Rubio, will provide some sort of off-ramp for him. So watch the markets in the US and around the world. That's going to be the tell. If stocks plunge, if other markets take a hit, Trump will be ready, as he always is, to de-escalate, to negotiate. We're seeing meetings in Davos about this, and the president will monitor it all. But if markets hold and the collapse, it's not a collapse, but it's just a small hit, Trump will continue the pressure. He'll continue to pressure new tariffs on Europe. He'll continue to be all for ambiguity, whether it's on Truth Social or in interviews. Trump doesn't need to do this quickly.
The news media is no longer interested in the role of neutral arbiter. They want a more exciting, more morally uplifting role. And so they're leading the way of the resistance to Trump. And they are committed to hyper-sacralization. So the more the president criticizes Somalis and other sacralized groups, right, the more the mainstream media doubles down on the sacred nature of these groups he's attacking. So we've got a feedback loop where the more the president attacks the no-fly zone, the more resources the media puts into shielding it, the more hysterical they get, which makes finding the truth about these various groups even harder to find. And you have an increasing depth of nuance. You try to offer any kind of balanced critique between the two sides, and you get crushed. You're either a MAGA extremist or a regime shill. Not a lot of middle ground for unvarnished, data-driven, truth-driven, truth optimization analysis. If you're working in an elite space, the pressure becomes atmospheric. Officers become hyper-politicized. You're not just expected to do your job, you're expected to perform allyship and resistance. There is fear of getting fired, fear of the purge. You have completely incompatible cultures operating in the same office. In the military, you have the traditional warrior ethos and the modern managerial HR ethos of sacralized identity. The traditional military culture is built on the principle of extreme merit. In a combat unit, the only thing that matters is the ability of the man next to you to perform his job under fire, but no-fly zones force the military to put a higher priority on group representation and inclusive leadership, and so we've got a new non-combat metric in the chain of command, often overseen by lawyers, and as a result, we have less capable warriors. We have military officers realize that their advancement is not tied to their competence, it's tied to their ability to manage diversity metrics. Not about tactical brilliance, it's about propaganda and narrative and lying brilliance. So you have a cohort of political generals much more comfortable in a boardroom or in a TV studio than in a field command. The fear of violating one of these no-fly zones, these social taboos, creates a zero-defect environment regarding speech. Commanders become terrified that a single stray remark about a group performance or cultural friction will end their careers. They're afraid to criticize or discipline members of sacred groups. So you have chronic administrative caution, which is the opposite of the aggressive risk-taking mindset required for a military victory. You have a collapse in the sense of honor, and you have a collapse in recruitment. Right? When families see the military adopting DEI and the sacralized language of the elite, they start recommending service to their sons. They now see the military as just another American institution hostile to them.
He wants the optionality of getting the best deal possible. And that leads me to point 4. This is the biggest caution. There are people around Trump who worry that the threat could backfire, that in this case, Trump may have miscalculated, that in seeking leverage, he might have actually made a positive deal less likely. This is almost certainly going to end with a deal. And it's going to be a deal that doesn't involve the use of the American military. It doesn't involve a coercion of the Danes. And the U.S. is going to get some sort of control, military control, economic control. The question is Trump going to end up with a worse deal than he could have had he simply not engaged in these threats? Because the Europeans now will look like they are captive to the United States if they make a deal that's so favorable that it will appear to have been coerced. Some aides
Yeah, it's by no means assured that Trump's nasty tactics will be effective. So Protestant clergy seem to me about the weakest type of clergy, right? They are afraid to say anything that upsets women. They feel very comfortable listing all the defects of men, but they never list any group defects with women or with various sacred groups. They have sworn to uphold eternal truth, but they operate by the hero system of the secular elite. So they've lost the authority of their religious followers. They've lost the respect of the secular elite. They are now an elite adjacent class that's increasingly irrelevant, and people aren't coming to church. So how does an elite man remain within a system he doesn't believe in? He has to master the art of the covert signal. He has to use the social radar to find others who are also passing as true believers while privately holding to the unvarnished truth. You have to be like Christians in the catacombs of Rome in the first 3 centuries of Christianity. You have to have signals that are designed to be plausibly deniable, so that if a true believer hears them, they sound harmless or slightly edgy joke. But to someone in the know, they are a clear handshake across the divide. You have to be deadpan. Right? You have to take the official lying narrative, you have to take the sacralization of various groups to its absolute logical extreme with a complete straight face. You have to perform virtue and do it in a way that is so absurd it borders on parody. The true believer will nod in agreement, see it as a sign of extreme commitment, but fellow skeptic will recognize the mockery. They will respond with a similarly absurd escalation. So this hyper-compliance is a way to mock the regime while appearing to be its most loyal subject. Then you'll also see the tell of overcorrection. Those elites who do not want to live by lies will signal their skepticism through a visible and theatrical hesitation before using the sacred vocabulary. So before using systemic equity as a phrase or assigned at birth, the man might pause for just a fraction of a second or use a tone that is just slightly too clinical. He just doesn't demonstrate enough enthusiasm in the woke vocabulary. And he will be signaling that he is quoting from a required script rather than speaking from conviction. Humor relies on inside jokes that require a specific set of uncool knowledge to understand. So if you throw around terms like the cathedral, preference falsification, or Lindy, right, these terms function like a digital watermark. Right, you are now part of the alt-stack information network. Right, you'll get a safety check. You might make a passing reference to a 1970s Dallas Cowboys game or specific scene from a classic film that has not been reimagined for modern sensibilities. So you'll test to see if the other person shares the trad value, the unmediated past. Often the most powerful signal that you can share is what is not said. When a sacralized group is discussed with a hushed reverence in the faculty lounge or in the boardroom, 2 skeptics might catch each other's eyes for a brief moment. There is no smile, just a shared heavy silence. The look communicates, we both know this is a lie, and we both know we cannot say this is a lie. So you have a shadow network growing within institutions, groups of men who are outwardly compliant but inwardly separate. They use jokes and signals not for fun. These are essential for survival. They remind the man that he is not alone in valuing truth. There is still a world of reality and truth outside these no-fly zones. He can maintain his social standing and keep his soul intact, and he can wait for the moment and pray for the moment when the mask of lies can be dropped.
Around Trump, according to the Wall Street Journal, are worried that the saber rattling continued Trump's failure to take force off the table, which he did again on Monday night with NBC News, could harden resistance in Europe. That the Europeans are taking him seriously, but they're also going to have to take their own credibility seriously. Pressure from Trump, we've seen this in the past, it works until it doesn't. And Europe now is offended and alarmed and getting publicly dug in. We've seen all week press releases and public statements from the European leaders saying Trump is not going to control Denmark, and that may have raised the price. It may be that the president gets a deal eventually, and everybody I know is saying there'll eventually be a deal, but he may be on a more narrow path. That's an open question. We'll see. No shortage of confidence in most of the administration, but some are worried that he's overplayed his hand here by making too many explicit threats that have.
So all sorts of things are good at a certain quantity, but you exceed that quantity of whether it's threat or exercise or water, you exceed the safe quantity and it becomes dangerous. So when you have certain groups that get sacralized and you have a no-fly zone around any kind of standard, rigorous public criticism, analysis, description, right? Think about historically vulnerable and marginalized and sacred groups such as Jews, blacks, gays, Muslims, right? This does not tend to increase social harmony. Instead, it creates a volatile emotional economy characterized by moral asymmetry. Groups are still subject to criticism, right? But it's only criticism delivered privately. And normal people begin developing a profound and lasting resentment. They see that they are getting screwed. And we don't judge our well-being, our happiness in a vacuum. We judge it relative to others. So when a man sees that liars and sacralized groups are protected from the social consequences of their actions, are exempt from professional sanction for offensive speech or public scrutiny for group trends, and his own group, by contrast, is fair game for vilification, he experiences deprivation. This is not just a simple anger over harm. He will develop moral indignation at a wrongdoing by a society and elite, by institutions who manage the public square. Right? He will feel his mind getting poisoned when he feels impotent to change an unfair status hierarchy. This will breed a lasting rancor that seeks a target for retaliation, and very likely that target will be Jews. Sacralization turns protected groups into a proxy for the hostile elite. Because the elites use these groups as a moral shield to justify censorship and no-fly zones, the groups will become targets of the antipathy originally meant just for the elite and their institutions. You get a dehumanization through exemption. If a group is not accountable to the same rules that govern everyone else and the same type of criticism and observation, then they are no longer part of the circle. They're outside the circle of trust. Criticism is social feedback and acknowledges the agency of the person being criticized. When you exempt a group, you signal that they are too fragile, too weak, too sacred, too other to handle the truth. So this creates a distance that makes it easier for the criticized groups to view the sacralized exempt groups as an alien or parasitic or hostile force. All these no-fly zones shift society from a cooperative model to a zero-sum power struggle. Status is now tied to protected status. Right, different groups compete for the position of the most marginalized. So you have a race to the bottom that destroys social trust.
Really unsettled the Europeans. Okay. The last question is the price for the Greenlanders. We've talked about this here. We talked about it last week. I keep hearing that in the end, this is not going to be a decision for the Europeans, not for Denmark. Greenland and the people in Greenland are going to decide. And the Trump folks have already discussed this. Cash, mineral rights, infrastructure, long-term guarantees where the future for the folks in Greenland can be better than they currently have. So
if you're not part of a sacred group, if you're not part of a group that is exempt from any public social criticism, you are now part of the unprotected. So when you realize that the new rules of the public square are designed to permanently disadvantage you, you're going to stop playing by the rules. You'll start to develop a deep-seated desire to get even with the system that has been rigged against you. So the middle ground is disappearing. Can't have a shared public square when the entrance fee is a commitment to lying. So we have a society of mutually assured resentment where every group feels like the victim and every other group is seen as an oppressor or as an unfair favorite of the regime. When the man realizes the game is rigged, his behavior shifts from cooperation to survivalist strategic play. When he sees that he is subject to rules that do not apply to sacralized groups, he will harden. He will not be chill. He won't view his participation in society as a way to build up the common good. He will view it as a series of tactical extractions leading to more extreme choices, more isolation, because the middle ground has been removed by the no-fly zones of the elite. He will delink his economic survival from mainstream institutions. If he has to lie to get promoted, he will look for an exit. He will move towards alternative companies, private equity, solo consulting, anything to get away from HR-managed no-fly zones. He'll participate in economic and epistemic secession. He no longer trusts the institutions, and he'll move his wealth into hard assets, land, gold, digital currency. He will prepare for a future where the rig system collapses under the weight of its own lies and incompetence. When the elite man knows the education system is the primary engine of the universal lie, it's likely to make radical choices regarding his children. He'll employ homeschooling as a defensive measure. He will move his family to red jurisdictions or sovereign enclaves where social work pressure to perform the lie is lower. He will sacrifice the humanities of a major city for his ability to live in a truth-optimizing environment. When the rules are not level, people start respecting the rules. This is the most dangerous shift for civilization. If you think the election was rigged, then there are no moral brakes on your behavior. If law is just a weapon used only against non-sacred groups, the elite man may begin to treat the law as a mere obstacle to be navigated rather than a moral obligation. He'll become more comfortable with bending regulations and practicing tax avoidance because he no longer believes the state is a neutral actor. He'll stop caring about the long-term health of his industry or his country. He will focus entirely on his own in-group, his family, his extended family, his trusted shadow network. He will become a mercenary in a suit. He'll extract as much value as possible from a system that he believes is doomed. These choices are not cool, they're not moderate, they are the desperate maneuvers of a man who feels he is being hunted down by a hostile managerial class who have rigged the system to protect certain groups and taught him that the most capable, most truth-telling, most committed members of society, that they have to stop being citizens and start becoming partisans.
Peter Brimelow, thank you so much for doing this. I thought of you last week when I read this. I don't know how much you follow X, but there were a couple exchanges that suggested to me that things are changing very, very fast. Okay, so here's one. This is a tweet from last week, less than a week ago, from basically an anonymous account, and I'm quoting: "If white men become a minority, we will be slaughtered. Remember, if non-whites openly hate white men while white men hold a collective majority, then they will be 1,000 times more hostile and cruel when they're a majority over whites. White solidarity is the only way to survive." Okay, that's on the internet. Elon Musk retweets it and says, 100%. And then Elon Musk writes this: "If current trends continue, whites will go from being a small minority of the world population today to virtually extinct!" Exclamation point. All of that, in my opinion, is obviously true. And I think most people know it. But I read that and I thought, here's the world's richest man who owns this platform and a lot of other things saying this. And Peter Brimelow, who I know, who's a thoroughly decent person, has had his life turned upside down and basically been destroyed in some ways, professionally anyway, for saying things that are way more restrained for that than that. So I have to ask you what it feels like to see that.
It feels kind of tingly. I mean, on the one hand,
tingly.
I'm happy that the debate has moved in that direction, and the things that we were talking about 25 years ago on vdare.com, which was my website, my birthright citizenship and so on, are now in the public debate. On the other hand, we've been ruined, and we're facing personal ruin, of course, because of this attack on us by the New York Attorney General, Letitia James. As nobody knows who I am, Tucker, I should say that, I'm a long time, in spite of my accent, I've been here for 55 years, and I'm a long time financial journalist. I work for Forbes and Fortune and the Barron's and so on. And I work for National Review. I wrote for National Review a lot, and I wrote a piece on immigration in 1992 saying time to rethink immigration. That's sometimes credited with kicking off the modern debate. And there was a brief civil war within the conservative movement at that point, which we lost, and Buckley stabbed us in the back and purged the magazine of immigration patriots. And for the next while, the Wall Street Journal editorial page was absolutely dominant, and they were going on about the need for amnesty, and there was no way to combat it. So I set up a website, which I named vdare.com after Virginia Dare, the first English child, not white child, as they always say, born in the New World. And over a period of about 25 years, we built up into quite a force until about 2 years ago, it was destroyed by the New York Attorney General, Letitia James, who just basically subpoenaed us to death, and has in fact now sued us personally and as in the foundation and through the foundation. So we're a bit like General Flynn, no middle-class family can stand up to this. General Flynn had to sell his house, and we're going to be driven into personal bankruptcy, I guess.
It's a horrifying story. I've kept abreast of it through your wife, who texts me as a wonderful person.
I have a hunch that Stephen Miller, who of course is an aide to Trump, I think he's the deputy chief of staff or something, he's going to be the first Jewish president. I say this because it's hard, the prospect horrifies people so much. But he's like Disraeli in Britain. Benjamin Disraeli, of course, was Jewish, but converted to Episcopalianism. He was converted by his father to a very early age. His father converted, took the whole family over to being Episcopalians. He basically invented the Conservative Party and reinvented the Conservative Party in the 19th century. He came up with in Britain. He came up with a complete grand strategy for it based on the empire and imperial patriotism and so on. And that really carried the party through for the next 80 or 90 years. A couple of generations. The Conservative Party in Britain was a nationalist party, and it, because of being a nationalist party, it got a very substantial working class vote because it is the blue collar workers who are the patriots, and the Conservative Party was able to tap into that. Now, Miller's done the same thing. He's invented a grand strategy for the Republican Party, which he desperately doesn't want to take up because it's run by cowards and fools. But he thinks they should move towards restabilizing America's ethnic balance and basically eliminating this immigrant inflow, which is causing all kinds of problems with the lower skilled workers and ultimately changing the racial balance. And he's not afraid to admit that. And not only that, but
I don't think anyone should
be
afraid.
Cunning to survive the Kushner White House. He did. Sessions was his close aide and was his mentor. And then Miller abandons him when Trump turns against him. I couldn't have done that either. But then he's in the White House and I'm not.
Yeah, no, I think those are all fair and true observations. It's interesting, though, the degree to which the immigration project is a demographic project. I mean, it has almost explicitly been an effort to make America less white. They'll say that. It's not controversial. I mean, you could prove it on video. Or didn't even bother to, because I think most people watching this already know that. Its architects, starting with Teddy Kennedy in 1965, basically just said, ultimately admitted, the whole point is to make America less white, a non-majority white country. Why is it so hard for conservatives to say the same? If Democrats are saying we want America to be non-white, why can't conservatives say that that's what their motive is?
I have to say that Kennedy didn't say that when he was
at first.
When he was the floor manager of the Hart Cellar Act. He gave a very explicit assurance.
Yes,
you love to quote, saying that this will not alter the racial balance of America, and it will not mean 1 million people a year will be coming in. Whereas in fact, 1 million people a year are coming in.
Of course,
and that's one of the reasons I bitterly regret not having Vidar, or even though I have my own peterbrimlow.com Substack. That's not the same kind of voice, because we've got to get legal immigration into the debate here. I think what Trump has done on illegal immigration is remarkable and more remarkable than people realize. But they're not doing anything on legal immigration. But I'm sorry, that means I'm not answering your question. What was your question?
Well, my question was the whole point of the project, state of California.
Well, when I was writing the book I wrote on immigration, Alien Nation, that flowed out of my cover story, the 95 book, which HarperCollins refused to reprint, I quoted a man called Earl Raab, who was a Jewish activist and so on, and he explicitly said that the Jews were in favor of mass non-white immigration because it makes the rise of I didn't use the term neo-Nazi, but that's what he meant, party in America impossible. In fact, he does the exact opposite. It makes it more likely.
Well, exactly.
But he did say that. He quite calmly said that this is why most Jews favor.
Well, it's also made the rise of hard-edged anti-Israel politics. And I'm not pro-Israel, especially, but I don't hate Israel.
Right.
A lot of people who hate Israel are immigrants. So
well, look at the New York minority race.
Well, exactly.
Van Damme won because of the immigrant vote.
Exactly. Exactly. So it's been...
the native-born American New Yorkers, and God knows, look at who they are, for God's sake. But they voted for against Van Damme.
Exactly.
So they've really screwed themselves up.
This hasn't worked.
That's right.
I mean, if your interest was to keep anti-Semitism and really kind of crazy anti-Israel sentiment to a minimum, and I agree with that. I'm against anti-Semitism. And I'm against basing your life on hating Israel. That seems kind of lunatic. If that was your goal, I mean, you literally achieved the opposite result. Is that fair to say?
Not for the first time. Yeah,
that's fair.
Right.
Fair. So you think maybe that
was appalling performance. So Steve Saylor, who's one of our writers who we've had on, pointed out that if they could just increase that proportion of the white vote to what his father got, which was like 57, 58%, that would swamp and overwhelm any possible conceivable gain among minority voters. So we were saying you should go for the white vote. Now, this caused a great deal of trouble for us. I remember I got an email from Jude Winniski. Do you remember Jude Winniski? He was a great supply theory. He said, Peter, you've gone too far. In other words, appealing to the white vote is not allowed. And look, it's just a question of arithmetic. There's more of them than there are of minorities. In any case, to this day, the Republicans have still not done that. They've done it tacitly.
Why was Jude Winniski mad?
Jude was a liberal, and way back when he was a liberal Democrat, and he still had a lot of these reflexes. But it was just thought to be. People just got very emotional about it. They think it's somehow illegitimate, and they still do think it's illegitimate. For example, so we see in Virginia in this last election. There's a Youngkin who's a complete cipher as far as a Wall Street cipher, as far as I can see, has his success in the gubernatorial race. A candidate who was 1, an immigrant, 2, a woman, and 3, black. She's a black Jamaican immigrant. And this is how he's going to appeal to the white vote. They're going to get people in the south or the hollows of Southwest Virginia out to vote for this black immigrant. It's ridiculous. And of course, they got a terrible share of the white vote. It was like 53%, and that's why they lost. But they would rather lose than make a full-out appeal to white vote.
I think the tell was in the ability. So this was I'm not saying a bad person, but Winsome Sears was not a good candidate. It was kind of an incapable candidate and hard to deal with. So, they chose her because she was black.
That's right.
Despite the fact that she wasn't good at her job.
I mean, this is epidemic in the Republican Party.
Well, it's epidemic in the country.
They've chosen but the Republicans in particular, they've chosen so many black candidates. They're about to do it here in Florida. The next gubernatorial candidate is likely to be black unless a miracle occurs. Why is that? They are just pixelated by this, transfixed by this. I'm trying to find the right word. Hypnotized by this phenomenon by the whole race question. They're just race whipped is what it comes down to. They're just so afraid of being called racist that they'd rather lose with a black candidate than run a candidate who appeals to whites. Trump did appeal to whites, not enough, but he does it in some kind of really implicit way. If you actually look at what Trump said, in spite of all the rhetoric, he's not said anything that's explicitly white nationalist or anything. I see no sign that he's anything other than a civic nationalist. But for some reason, he's made some connection. I mean, all through West Virginia, for that, while Biden was president, you would see these signs supporting Trump and saying very rude things about Biden. And these are outside trailer
Very
homes.
rude things about Biden, yeah.
I mean, this is a poor area. These rundown trailer homes that you see with these Trump signs on them. For some reason, Trump made a connection with them. And it's eerie. Now, on the other hand, he also made a disconnection with the other side. So you get this Trump derangement syndrome. Yeah. But he was able to mobilize the white vote.
Why do you think that was?
Which part of it?
That he was able, working class whites love Trump. Trump is not a racist. I've never seen any sign of that at all, and not a white nationalist at all, and hardly a Christian nationalist. But he, for some reason, had an emotional connection with these voters. Why? Do you know?
There's a concept in sociology called implicit community, communities that represent or appeal to some people without actually saying it explicitly. The classic example with NASCAR, for example. Why is NASCAR a white stronghold? Or everybody watching NASCAR is white. And the NASCAR operatives don't like this. And
they hate it.
Yeah, they're constantly trying to diversify. Republican Party is a classic example of this. I mean, without ever doing anything to deserve it, the Republicans have become absolutely unbeatable in Virginia. And you and I both remember then when the Democrats were unbeatable in Virginia. You know, I forget when the last I always keep forgetting when the last Republican Democrat to carry West Virginia was, but it might have been Clinton. And now it's just the Democrats have ceased to exist in West Virginia, even though this is a very poor state. But Republicans prevailed simply by virtue of not being Democrats.
Bill Clinton lost California in '92 and won West Virginia. That's how much has changed.
Yeah, right. So there's something that's going on at a very deep psychological level, some kind of implicit signaling. I mean, it's baffling. Now, of course, he did say, you know, when he came down the elevator and said just a few words about Mexico, about Mexican immigration, and never looked back. So he obviously struck a nerve there. So he did enough to strike a nerve, and simply by raising immigration in the sort of rather you know, I'm sure it drives Stephen Miller crazy, incoherent and peculiar, and constantly forgets his lines and says the wrong thing way that Trump does talk about immigration. But he did raise it, and of course, until then, it's been driven out of Republican politics completely. I know we wrote about it for 16
you
years.
were fired over it, right?
Just and there was almost no sign that any Republican would pick it up. But then when he did the dam broke, and now what a big difference that I found, Tucker, is if you speak to grassroots Republicans as opposed to elected Republicans, the consensus is overwhelming that immigration's got to be ended. The consensus is overwhelming. Whereas when I got involved in this in the early 90s, a lot of Republicans never heard of this question, and they would.
All right, that's Tucker Carlson interviewing Peter Brimelow. Here is Laura
parts
Ingraham.
before the president's meet in April.
All right, Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much. We'll be looking forward to seeing what transpires over the next couple of days.
Thanks. Have a great day.
And it's clear that China is trying to really grab onto the Western world with a stranglehold, and now Europe has found itself in a position where it's become nearly impossible to sever ties with China. So instead, they're sucking up to the CCP, as I said in the angle. So today, French President Emmanuel Macron begged for more Chinese investment in Europe.
China is welcome, but what we need is more Chinese foreign direct investment in Europe in some key sectors to contribute to our growth, to transfer some technologies.
Well, European leaders are working with China, you know, if the United States turns out like it's not a reliable partner, that's going to work. Meanwhile, the UK is also caving, approving China's plan for a mega embassy in London, despite clear security concerns about its location and position. And as I mentioned, last week, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney launched a new, quote, strategic partnership with China. Here with us to discuss all of this, Peter Schweizer, author of the new book, The Invisible Coup. Peter, that's all happening in Europe and in Canada. But let's talk about what's happening right here in the United States of America. Why is it that there seems to be a continued soft spot in our country for Chinese investment, Chinese students, Chinese, birth motels, all of it, which ultimately will affect our national security down the road?
Well, a part of it, Laura, is that they have effectively bought off large portions of America's elite, political elite, certainly elements in Wall Street, the entertainment industry. So these are groups, these elites have incentives to do what China wants them to do because they're going to make money. The problem is that these elites are either overlooking or ignoring the central fact of the U.S.-China relationship, which is China's goal, Laura, Laura, you've talked about this before, is not about getting a better deal or maybe, capturing a larger share of the market. Sure, they want that, and they want political leverage over the United States. What they're really engaging in is civilizational warfare. They believe, and they say this openly, this is not me saying it, that they are at war with the Christian civilization of the United States with its emphasis on individual rights. So they have carried out a series of policies, birth tourism that's happening on a massive scale that has horrifying national security implications for us when you start to look at the actual numbers involved.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that. The issue of Chinese women coming into the United States, third trimester of pregnancy. There were hotels, birth motels in California and Long Beach and Long Island. A lot of those have been busted up, but you say this goes far beyond just those two parts of the country, that now we have Chinese citizens in the United States that are fanned across this country, north, south, east, and west. And what's the long-term plan here?
Yeah, Laura, so what they've done is created an industrial model to exploit birthright citizenship. This idea that if you happen to be born in the United States, you get U.S. citizenship automatically. China began about 13 years ago pushing for this, pushing for the Chinese elite to come to the United States and have children here. Our federal government has no idea how many Chinese nationals have done this because we do not collect data on birth certificates. If you have a birth certificate, they don't list the nationality of the parents. So our federal government has no clue. China has looked into this themselves, and the numbers are stunning. They say over the last 13 years, roughly every single year, approximately 100,000 Chinese have been born in the United States. These are children of the elites. The parents take them back to China, where they are raised in CCP schools. They are raised by the parents who are, military officers, intelligence officers, et cetera. And when they turn 18, which is going to start a couple of years from now, Laura, they're going to be able to vote. They're going to be able to get government jobs. They're going to be able to do a whole host of things, even though they have absolutely no connection to the United States whatsoever. The problem is compounded by this surrogacy problem. You have Chinese elites who are donating their sperm. They find a carrier or a woman in the United States to give birth to their child. Again, the child is given birth in the United States. It becomes a U.S. citizen. The Wall Street Journal found a couple of weeks ago one Chinese elite that had over 100 children that were born this way. Again, the federal government has no idea of the numbers. We looked at just Southern California, and there we found, Laura, 107 Chinese-owned surrogacy companies in just Southern California.
But I have a question. What is Congress doing about this? I mean, we have birthright citizenship unless the Supreme Court comes to its senses. But nevertheless, from the buying of land to the buying of American food companies, gobbling up residential real estate, Congress doesn't seem to have any appetite to do anything. I mean, it can't all be on President Trump.
I agree completely, Laura. A couple of weeks ago, the book's out today. A couple of weeks ago, we were up on Capitol Hill, met with senators, chairman of several committees, including Foreign Relations and House Oversight. We're expecting action on Capitol Hill, and we're also expecting action in the executive branch. The Supreme Court case is going to be crucial, and I believe some of the things that we have discovered are going to be subject to that Supreme Court discussion. This is not random. This is organized and being done on an industrial scale.
Yeah, and we didn't even get into the crossing the border illegally, all the Chinese with their little roller bag suitcases, and other people from other nationalities as well. Peter, you've been on this for years.
Okay, that's it for today. Talk to you later, mate. Bye.